In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
Very nice words there. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us back on the Ben Stewart Podcast. Last week, if you didn't tune in, we were talking a lot about the latest 60 Minutes episode that came out that's uncovering a lot of the UFOs and UAP phenomenon, and UAP would be unidentified aerial phenomena. I find it interesting, and maybe we can actually this time around clarify why that wording is different than unidentified flying objects, because maybe aerial phenomena are not flying objects. But interestingly, we also were touching upon disclosure that's coming in June. And that was something that was part of the omnibus package in December. It was just one of those things that was snuck in there, and it started a 180-day clock of disclosure. And that's something we were talking about last time. The chat was off the hook. It was really interesting. We were in real time taking what people were saying in the chats. This time around, we're going to stick a little bit more to the format that we want to stick to get the content out to you. Gordo's really going to take charge of showing some clips that kind of lay out a little bit of the history of it today. But really, definitely leave your comments, because that was one of the most fascinating parts of our last podcast, was getting all the questions, talking about it, seeing where people's beliefs and skepticisms and even their beliefs of what belief and knowledge and stuff like that really is. So we're going to try and address some of your questions there towards the end. But yeah, Gordon, why don't you just give us a quick understanding of what we talked about last time and where we're picking up now and what you have lined up for people to see?
Yeah, definitely. And just so people know, we will, I think it's totally a great idea for us to do some Q&A at the end. So we will do some Q&A at the end. We just want to kind of get all the content there and then focus on the questions at the end. But to kind of give a quick little recap of last episode, like you said, we really were focusing on present day disclosure and present day things happening that really were shaking things up with, as you referred to, these three specific official videos that were released: the Gambit, the FLIR, and the Go Fast video. And the June omnibus bill, this UAP task force, Senator Reid, all these various key figures who have pushed this along. And I think one of the key things that a lot of people in this space would be referred to as ufology, see this. There's a lot of mixed messages. I've seen a lot of YouTube videos coming up now that, like, is this all a psyop? And like anything the government's telling us is going to be completely part of some big narrative and psyop. And like we said, that's definitely part of this. And I do think part of it is maybe they want to control the narrative, but also I think part of this is the dam is breaking, and it's a little bit of just damage control. And so we'll have to see. I think that's kind of more speculation right now. It's hard to know for sure. But what we can, I think, know for sure to help us have a better idea of where we're going is historical context. So historically, this isn't really the first sort of version of an ATIP program. This isn't the first time the government has had some, whether it's classified or unclassified, program dealing with this subject. And it would make sense. Anytime if this was ever very legitimate, you would think they would immediately have some sort of way to investigate this, just part of national security, whatever it is. And so it makes sense. And so really, when you look at the period of World War II and post-World War II is when you start to really see some of these early versions of what we would call like an UAP task force or an ATIP program. And
ATIP being access to information and privacy. Yeah.
No, actually, no. It's the aerial.
That's not it?
No, Advanced Aerial Threat Intelligence Program.
We got to get on the same page before I act like I know something.
It's all good.
I put up ATIP and it says access to information and privacy, and I was like, oh, it must be about like UFO
That's important too.
documents
That's
and stuff
another
like that.
that's another episode we got to do on privacy
All right,
rights.
so clarify just in case it got confusing for people.
So ATIP, and somebody can fact check me on this, but I'm pretty sure it's like Advanced Aerial Threat Identification Program, and then the UAP Task Force is obviously Unidentified UAP Task Force. So the UAP Task Force was the big umbrella program, from my understanding, and ATIP was a smaller program as part of that. So the big chunk of money went to UAP Task Force, smaller chunks went to these certain break-off programs they're studying. ATIP's the one we know about. There could be other ones, and apparently there are, from what Mellon and Lizondo and various people involved with that. Now, people who are skeptical of them are obviously going to be skeptical of anything they say, but that's what has been said. So essentially, though, historically, this has been something that has been taken a serious notice by the government, and specifically certain branches of the government. And this is where I think, as we talked about last time, it's important to really get into nuance. And are we just talking about the entire government? Are we talking about all the private sectors? Who specifically in the government would be tasked, have classification, have security clearance, and have the know-how and connections to really be involved in these circles? And what you start to find, and it's what a lot of people have said about various things within the intelligence community for a long time, is a lot of times really it is very much a need-to-know basis, and that doesn't necessarily mean that the chief of staff or the cabinet of the president and the president himself might not be in that need-to-know. Now, there's debates within the ufology of what presidents are more briefed in than other ones, and I think that is probably the case. Certain ones probably did, and certain ones didn't. I tend to find that the ones who would seem like they would actually, tell the public more tend to be usually not given as much access, and the ones who kind of are just like, the famous story of Jackie O'Neill from the Honeymooners, Jackie Gleason, from the Honeymooners show or movie being shown by, I believe it was Nixon, and then Reagan. And like, there's all these famous stories of like Elvis being shown or Jackie Gleason and then being taken to these certain places, and so you wonder, like, I don't know, were they briefed in at one point and then they kind of blew it and loose lips started sinking ships? Or like, all right, no presidents in general. I don't know. That's all part of this sort of behind the scenes of who gets to know. But there are more objective things we can sort of base our judgments off of, historically speaking. We know specific committees. We can talk about specific events, certain key figures. So really, to kind of kick things off and get things moving along here, I felt a good area to really focus is World War II. And World War II, the two main key things that start kicking off that you start to see are two things. One is this notion of Foo Fighters, which the famous band actually did name themselves off of that real phenomenon during World War II. When you're in this series dogfights, these pilots, just like modern day, Commander Fravers, you could imagine actually being in a dogfight and then seeing something that just looks like this orange. I mean, there's a picture, and basically they're these spherical, glowing orb, orange-looking things while you're in a dogfight, risking your life in the heat of the moment, but then also going like, this is like, what is this? And like, just I couldn't even imagine like how to just grok and take that all in while you're in the middle of some sort of dogfight. But that's what's going on apparently. Many pilots saying that. And then also the other big component is the Nazi bell. And Joseph Farrell, there's a clip we're going to show of him speaking with Richard Dolan. He's someone I really respect and a top researcher in this field. Has been doing it for a long time. He's written many, many books specifically covering, discussing World War II and really dives deep into the Nazis, what they were doing with research and development, and gets into all these nuances, gets into the details, listens, he's listening and reading the testimonies of Nuremberg trial, top Nazi scientists and what they're saying. He's saying, this is specifically what these Nuremberg scientists involved in these programs were saying. And, obviously we won't go too much down the line, but obviously then you have Operation Paperclip. Everyone knows, obviously, Werner von Braun within NASA. It's pretty bizarre and strange, these connections that start to be made between the top rocket scientists and people in the cutting edge research of the, straight up Nazi Third Reich, and then certain elements, upwards of maybe hundreds, maybe thousands, the estimate is it's in the thousands probably of actual legit Nazi scientists then getting involved within our own aeronautics programs. And so there's this weird you start to see there's these weird moving parts to things. It's not just, what's going on, but who really what are the agendas, who's calling shots, and are there certain elements of this that maybe we just, our power, the power of the possibility of what these guys knew blinded us to then maybe allowing some sort of corrupt, coercive influence as well. And that's tricky to know. That's a little bit more speculation, but we do know, these real scientists were involved, early on. So the first thing I could get into is what specifically are we referring to? What were they doing? What's the bee's knees all about? And the Nazi bell is the big thing that Farrell wants to discuss. So before we play that clip, is there anything you want to tag on to that that sticks out to you?
Just clarifying Operation Paperclip, which was after World War II. There were a lot of top scientists, like a lot of people were put on trial for sure, but the whole, as it goes, a lot of people were given safe haven even throughout South America. I know I heard in Argentina, Chile, and they were spread out, but probably accessed in those locations as well, as travel was just a lot more common, becoming a lot more common. Having a top scientist somewhere down in South America wasn't inaccessible anymore, so you could still utilize what they were working on during World War II. And I do just want to say that, when I'm looking at the advancement of technology, where we're going with it, I often talk about this overarching thing that's called the transhuman agenda. But a lot that we know about with medicine comes from war. There were a lot of discoveries of how, trauma resolution with somebody who just lost a limb, what kind of drug interactions work, antibiotics, blood transfusions. I think that was World War I. And there was a lot of this going on. And then there was a lot of experimentation. And you hear about in some of the Nazi camps, as well as over in Japan, that there was a lot of experimentation, human experimentation, sewing this part on to another person, animal hybrid types of things like that. And we don't we just hear that and we're like, ooh, creepy. That's super weird. But what did they learn about grafting? And potentially also now we're seeing more later in the 1900s in wartime, people lose an arm and then they get a bionic arm or something in its place. Nowadays, you see this rock climber on TED Talks who lost both his legs, and he has legs with 24 microchips and sensors inside them, and it's really intelligent the way it reads from the body. So what I'm saying is that even in wartime situations, a lot of the times there's what we would call our understanding of the impetus of war. Like it's all about economics, and World War II was against fascism, socialism, and yada, yada. And a lot of it, when you see that it was funded by singular sources, both sides funding by singular sources, there's a lot of mechanical engineering that comes up during wartime as well. You have people in this urgency mode that they're pushed to be clever, creative, and they're creating things. So I'm really interested to hear what you have lined up for us, especially around World War II, because my thoughts were a lot of these wars also had underlying agendas of figuring out how robotics can be applied to humans, because cybernetics was already written right around that time. So, yeah, super excited.
At that time period, it's so bizarre because essentially, they were given and they kind of talk about this as part of, just this idea of the labor force, basically millions of slaves, as a labor force, and they had no bar. I mean, Rogan talked about this. I'm blanking on the woman. She has an amazing book all about this. I believe it's Maria. But she talked all about this. But essentially, they had no barrier. I mean, this was mad science taken to the nth degree. There was nothing holding back, not from, electromagnetics. It didn't matter what it was. So, if you can imagine, if we're, keeping this sort of just in the lane of aerodynamics and electrogravitics and the things we're talking about of flight propulsion, they were pushing the limits in whatever the way they could. And we'll talk about this. That meant, if German scientists died in the process of trying to create these and make these devices and crafts, they did, and that was just part of the process. And so let me pull up this clip and play. This is Farrell with Richard Joel, and just a key component of him talking about specifically what was the Nazi bell, this famous craft that the Nazis were designing.
The Bell is very famous, infamous. It's almost legend because, as far as I know, all the information about it came out, correct me if I'm wrong, after the war during some trials in Eastern Europe against Nazi war crimes. And locals, I believe, in Czechoslovakia talked about this experiment, and it was called Die Glock, the Bell. And it involved, as Nick Cook wrote about way back in, I think, 2002, that book was, it involved like rotating mercury, and it created a kind of a plasma field, if I'm not mistaken. And the effects of it were, well, what were the effects? That's the interesting thing. It was deadly, and it might have had some kind of, people have argued, some kind of field propulsion effect. But I've never been clear on this.
All right. The Bell story is coming out of an affidavit that was sworn out by an SS general that was tried by a post-war war crimes trial in Poland. His name was Jakob Sporenberg. And all of the details about the Bell are coming out of this affidavit. And the details themselves are both very specific and at the same time very ambiguous. And this is where the reverse engineering part comes in. But basically the details are that this device was about 15 feet wide, maybe 15 to 18 feet tall. It was kind of bell-shaped. There are indications that this was kind of a ceramic covering of some sort. On the inside of this device, Sporenberg said that they had two counter-rotating drums. Now, he does not say whether or not these drums were nested one inside the other or stacked one on top of the other. In my view,
so counter-rotating, one going this way and one going
the other
this
going
way.
the other way. Right. Now, inside of these counter-rotating drums, they put a serum, which was codenamed Serum 525, which he described again as being a heavy, cherry red, maroon-like substance that was very, very heavy. And again.
Okay, so as he's saying there, he's describing how the craft actually worked and what it looked like. And once again, Dolan and Farrell get much more into the nuance of the backstory of where this information is coming from. But this essentially was from a Polish war crimes trial. A high-ranking member of the Nazi, I believe he was involved in the sciences, discussing what he saw at this facility where they were doing these types of testing. So as you can start to see, though, is they were using, he theorizes what specifically was in there. He says they had massive amounts of thorium, and this might have been some sort of mercury isotope that turned it red. And so that's more speculation. But bottom line is they were doing this. They were using massive amounts of electricity, and I'll tap into this a little bit more, but shocking this counter-rotating craft, and in the center had some sort of mixture of mercury and other things that they then were trying to create some sort of anti-gravitic effect. Now, he'll get more into this, but essentially this was very, very early and very primitive. So this isn't, what you expect to think, like when you think of the Vril Society and the Hanubin. He'll get into it. I'm pronouncing it, I think, improperly. But bottom line is, this wasn't like something we see modern day and what you kind of think of that's flying around doing right-angle turns, 10 to 15,000 mile an hour craft, like extremely fast. But it shows they did have some early, interest, and we're doing some serious research into this. And it doesn't mean, and I think he touched on this, that it may possibly get better and more advanced. But this is just key to show you what is the Bell, what specifically are we referring to, and how early this kind of R&D into this type of stuff begins.
That's interesting. As you're talking about shocking this thing, this counter-rotating craft, you're saying?
So
with something at the middle?
In
like
the middle,
nucleus?
basically the engine of the craft. Yeah, it has these counter-rotating, I believe, magnets, he said, that then have some sort of substance in the middle. And so where do they get that idea, though? Where is that coming from? That's where you start to then think, is this purely all original, or is this some sort of reverse engineering occurring?
Yeah, well, there's two things I want to say about that. And one is in 2020, I believe it might have been May, but it might have been March of 2020. I remember there was this thing coming out where this like nearly a centuries old paradox in science was solved inadvertently, in Australia. There's this university that was, I forget what they were trying to do, but they were trying to do one thing, and then they solved this problem of using just electricity to cause micro spin inside of a processor. So it has to do with, quantum computing and, well, really getting computers smaller and smaller. So it might have even been classical computing, but communicating on more and more of a micro level. And taking out the magnetism of it, they found a way to do it with just electricity, which means you could target a single thing and not affect, like magnetism is a field, electricity you can target and isolate a little bit more. So what makes me think of that is if what you're talking about was super craft or like rudimentary, kind of elementary in that day, where have they come since then? And I'm kind of using that more as just like an example of maybe it's gotten smaller and maybe it could become more systemic. And maybe there's actually a way that this understanding of using the electricity can work throughout a system of something in a wet matrix, like maybe wetware, and, working towards levitation of things that could become pseudo biological, or at least made more of kind of like the warm, wet kind of hardware that we use.
Right.
So,
yeah, you start to see the implications of if you start to extrapolate these kind of things, where now we're already talking brain neural interfaces. We can do things with robotics that are pretty impressive. And if there is serious money, which we'll get into near the end of this, but if there's serious money that is being invested not just in black operations and unacknowledged special access programs, but just things completely off the books, the work of Catherine Austin Fitts and what she did tracking, $20+ trillion missing from the Pentagon. You start to realize that if we're seeing these things already in the public sector by private individuals, I had a good buddy whose dad worked in the government, pretty classified stuff dealing with lasers. And, he'd always used to say, we usually have stuff 20 to 30, maybe 40, 50 years ahead of what you're already seeing in the public. And that's sort of a government insider type thing. But a lot of times the stuff we're getting in the public sector is usually something they've already had in covert elements that then, gets used to just purely be retail. So, yeah, you can start to now get a little more context to say some of the stuff we're talking about in present day that we might even have, just our own stuff, really would shock people. But it's not a very simple matter. There's a lot of, like I said, a lot of moving parts, a lot of agendas, and it's not as simple as just saying, well, okay, we'll show it to the public. There's a lot of people that don't want certain things to be known for whatever reasons, whether it's power and control, whether it's profit reasons, who knows, but whether it's just purely national security reasons, and they feel this is in the best interest of the people to not have us know certain things until they know better. We don't know everyone's personal beliefs for why certain things haven't been made more unclassified, but we can track it and put pressure on them. And like we're both saying, things are starting to heat up. It seems like there is more discussion internally going on in these departments in the present day. And I've always felt that there seems to be sort of two different competing schools of thought within the internal programs going on. People who are more okay with letting the public know versus people who are more like, no, they can't handle the truth. Kind of seems to be.
That's super interesting. And when you say it like that, there usually are, just look at the political arena. You have other parties, but there's really two main ideologies. So two main schools of thought. And, I've thought about that whole thing of like, well, we're big boys and girls. We should be able to learn anything you have to throw at us. If it's happening in the world and you're allowed to know it, we should be allowed to know it. And I've gone over and over in my head around like, yeah, to some extent, like who is to have the authority to say who is ready to hear what? And these people don't just wake up and find themselves in politics. There's a long road they travel. And in a sense, in the same way in a mystery school, if they're going to reveal a mystery, and like, historically it had to do with, in Buddhism, they did use psychedelics with meditation. In Hinduism, they did use psychedelics, and that was a lot of the times the mystery of the mysteries was using a psychedelic, doing some sacred sex act, and that's part of the magic of a secret Tibetan Buddhist whatever. And so there are certain things like if we were to just let everybody know. And I think back to Tesla and JP Morgan and Edison and all of that. And like, if we were to just open source the best at-home way to build some kind of system that can ramp up and accumulate a ton of, what would that be, kinetic energy, energy that hasn't been used yet. Maybe that's kinetic energy.
Potential turns to kinetic.
But okay, so potential energy. If you can build, a massive amount of potential energy because, you were an ex-Wall Street guy and you built this facility and you just do it and it's open source, then everyone would have the ability to potentially create some kind of their own massively damaging weapon of mass destruction. And this is like an extreme. Would humanity do that? I don't know. I don't believe so. But would some people do it? Absolutely. So there are certain things that I understand not getting out to the people because you don't know. Some people are probably so jaded about their lot in life that you can't really tell whether they would be in sound mind to make a decision if they could turn like an energy grid system into a potential weapon or something like that.
And I think most people's understanding of what the role should be of our intelligence community shouldn't be like, hey, you need to spy on all domestic citizens and look at our Facebook group. It's like, no, you should specifically, any secret that puts somebody's life directly at operational risk, then yeah, we don't want obviously our, officers and men and women involved in these things to be put at risk in a possible mission. But when it comes to like suppressing things for greedy or power motives, like, this is the crux of this issue in a lot of ways, is the energy, is what is the propulsion used by these craft, and what are the implications of that with this massive energy industry, which could make a massive amount of things obsolete. It could create incredible abundance and a much better way of life for people, but it also would become an extreme threat and be obsolete. It's similar with the drug war, a lot of these things where really money a lot of times is unfortunately the real issue, is it corrupts people from doing the right thing. Now it's like I said, and I don't know if we're ever going to know specifically from World War II who was the good white hat and bad white hat. Early on, it looks like somebody like, and we'll talk about this, Admiral Forrestal looked like a real white hat, and he was the first Secretary of Defense. He was a Secretary of the Navy, and he really was somebody who seemed to be like somebody who was trying to do the right thing and bring this out and was for justice and for letting the people know more. And, there's a really, really, really sketchy... Richard Dolan, I posted it in the details on the description of this video, but he goes into the whole life and death of Forrestal, and it's really, really strange how he passed away. He jumped or fell out of a 4-story building. All the indications said that he had no plans of suicide. And this guy was allegedly, and we'll get into this later, one of the key people behind MAJI, or MAJIC MJ-12, Majority Agency Joint Intelligence. So, there's some weird things, and this is where you get into like, okay, like, we have to obviously call a spade if we're speculating, but there are you see this with a lot of, within this field of ufology and energy propulsion, of strange things happening to certain individuals trying to expose and bring out certain things. And we could do a whole another episode on that kind of thing, but not to digress too much. So sticking back with our World War II, so we got the German Bell, and obviously you hear sort of the inner workings of how the German Bell looks. Now, moving forward, then Farrell kind of goes more into detail about the German Bell that are some critical details to keep in mind with this in this period, moving out of World War II.
His presentation of all of this material, he presents the fact that certain witnesses at the nearby Gross-Rosen concentration camp would see this kind of acorn device glowing a pale blue glow, levitating above the tree line at night, and he concluded that was a bell, and I think he's probably right. And here's the problem: all it does is levitate. It goes up and it comes down. It doesn't, it doesn't zigzag around in the sky like UFOs have been reported to do. So you're dealing, I think, here with perhaps a prototypical
highly experimental,
high energy experimental thing.
And would it have been for propulsion, or could it have been for any number of other things? I would wonder, right?
Well, the problem here is, you can use it for propulsion, but it's killing everybody. The first time they test this thing, it zaps, some of the scientists testing it into the nether realms. So you've got a device here that, is clearly some sort of prototypical technology, but it's not flying around. They can't put anybody in it to pilot it or steer it, and it still has to be connected to this honking big electrical plant. So So we can say that, yeah, this is kind of a step in the technology tree, but it's not to the stage that we get Haunebu and Vril-craft, flying around and flying to the moon and back and so on and so forth. No, it's not that at all.
So can I just ask you, well, the
sure.
bell, that's an interesting possibility. It seems to me that despite the fact that it's kind of sketchy in terms of the evidence, I mean, you have one guy's testimony after World War II talking about it. I get the feeling that you give that at least some reason for credibility, as opposed to Vril or Haunebu type craft, which, am I right in thinking you're not really impressed by the likelihood of them
well,
having
I'm not.
exist?
The difference here is that with the Bell story, and it's not just Sporenberg's testimony, there's a number of contextual things that indicate that the story has some traction. You've got Kurt Debus, who eventually comes to this country, goes to work for NASA. He was clearly working for a plasma project of some sort for the German firm that was actually building the equipment of the Bell, and so on and so forth. So you've got little contextual indicators that kind of surround the core of the story that indicate that it does have some traction. The problem with the Haunebu and Vril stuff is if you look at it, all of those details are missing. There's no way that you can go back and try and reconstruct a kind of a putative physics and engineering and personnel.
And just so people have context about what he's referring to when he says Vril. So the Vril Society were, and forgive me if I don't explain this perfectly, everyone, but essentially there's a group of extremely beautiful young women, apparently, who were allegedly able to make contact with an ET group through some form of mediumship or channeling, and were able to then actually have sessions, and the beings would describe themselves, describe where they came from, and describe the craft, how to design it, and all these kind of things. And apparently the Third Reich and the Nazis got wind of this, brought in all the women, asked them, questioned them about this, and then said, basically, keep doing what you're doing, and kind of let them keep doing their thing. That's, like Farrell's saying, that's a little bit tougher to prove exactly on multiple accounts. So he doesn't take those things. These are just what people know. And this is, teach his own. If you believe this, it's I'm not here to shoo or be dogmatic, but I'm just kind of giving people the groundwork and what, is the most concrete evidence we have, and just say when it's not as concrete, this isn't as concrete. So
can I just say something about the Vril? Oh yeah, you wanted to go on that because the Vril, just talking about what the Vril are, is pretty interesting.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's if you want to add any 2 cents, but essentially, very much into the occult, and was, one of these early medium group that made contact with allegedly an ET intelligence.
Yeah, so I mean, I heard about this a long time ago with Michael Tessarian. He's one of my earlier favorite researchers who really dug deep into this, and he is the one who first got me turned on to the book called The Coming Race by Edward Bulwer Lytton, and that was published in 1871. And so basically, and this is just on Wikipedia, which I don't, keep as dogma, but it actually does a pretty good job here. Some readers have believed the account of a superior subterranean master race. So it's not extraterrestrial, it's subterranean master race called the Vril, and that's the coming race. And he speaks about this race coming from under the ground. And so this was an actual belief. And Theosophists, you guys might know Theosophy, Madame Helena Blavatsky, as well as Rudolf Steiner, who started as a Theosophist and went to Anthroposophy and built Anthroposophy. They basically accepted the story as occult truth. And these were people that were coming in saying that there were a lot of ancient mystery schools within, or secret societies within, elder religions like Tibetan Buddhists in ancient India that Helena Blavatsky connected with, like secret masters that had understood that there were more races on the planet than just humans, right, and that they don't just come from elsewhere in the galaxy, but a lot of them come from underneath the ground. There are Native American myths that even go into subterranean master races, maybe not master races, but subterranean races, insectoid, ant-like people. Right. I mean, so this is something that had been going on for a while, even before World War II.
Right. And as you're pointing out, not only indigenous cultures, but there's a lot of different, schools of thought and ways that these certain figures and entities come about, and some will be more surprising than others. I'm curious, do you know if the Nazi symbol itself is actually an ancient Indian or Tibetan symbol, correct? That's a Sanskrit symbol. Do you know if that is in any way related to the vril, and was like, do you know if there's any through line with that?
Not specifically with the swastika, but if you go back to the Thule Society, like you ever seen Thule brand of on top of your van? Well, the Thule Society, and this is again, almighty Google is telling me this. Originally, the Studian group, I think it's it's basically a German occultist and group found in Munich shortly after World War I, named after a mythical northern country in Greek legend. So that would be Thule. Mm-hmm. And so when you look that up, when you just type in Thule Society, Third Reich on Google, you'll see the swastika as their logo there. But it was founded in 1918.
But if the Third Reich
that
is
symbol
using
goes
that...
way back in Tibetan Buddhism. You'll see it thousands of years ago in India. You'll see Native American symbols that very well represent not just something that could be the sun, but something that has spin. Because that's the thing about the swastika, is it's showing you a cross in spin, from a certain direction. And so that
has to do with photons or something subatomic.
And there's also something about the direction of the spin.
Right.
So apparently the Nazi symbol corrected the direction of the spin from either clockwise to counterclockwise or something along those lines.
And in no way are we endorsing neo-Nazism, just for the record.
No, we're showing
everyone.
The history of the symbols.
Yeah.
Like if
and the co-opting, how this idea of co-opting in a way, but why would they? The fact that the Thule Society, this was their symbol, and then the entire Third Reich used that same symbol, shows you. It seems like they really were giving a lot of credence to the Thule Society, or the Thule Society might have had a stronger impact than we realized. I don't know the through line. I don't know if Hitler actually attended meetings with the Thule Society, but it's kind of strange that they use that symbol.
Yeah, well, there's a good book called Hammer of the Gods, The Thule Society and the Birth of Nazism, that kind of shows the progression into it. But it's really good to mention people like Jamie Wheel from the Flow Genome Project just wrote the book Recapture the Rapture, and he's talking about how we can recapture ecstasis, meaning psychedelics, tantra, these things that really turn us on, but they're like fire. You can't have it all the time, as ways of not being culty, and how do you not turn it into a cult? But the thing is today, somebody like a beautiful mind like a Charles Eisenstein could come up with some kind of philosophy about how we should do things, and everyone seems to be like, this is beautiful, my God, this is incredible, we all need to rush towards it. And it's gift society, and it's all about bringing your inner gifts out. And then all of a sudden in 5 years there's a war, and there's a whole movement that Charles had nothing to do with, that's all like, well, in Charles's philosophy, he talks about how we're going to implement gift society and do it by coercion, and like turn it into what everyone feared would be just a socialist regime anyway. And so then you say like, oh man, Charles Eisenstein like was onto some very crappy stuff, and then you're like, no, this is like the same thing as like Christianity is rooted in gnosis or in Gnosticism. But when you read the Bible, you're not reading about Gnosticism. And so you're thinking, I'm learning about Christ, I'm all into Christianity because it's all in reverence to Christ. But most of what Christianity goes on to do over the next couple thousand years is not something that Christ would actually, and I'm not going to speak for the Christ energy, but it was perverted from there. Just like science. Science is great. What the institutions of science do are not perfect. So this is what I mean about that symbol specifically. What we're doing is we're showing that these symbols, like the swastika, has a spiritual root thousands of years ago. Just like if somebody were to make a tree symbol, the tree of life symbol, and then go out and murder 1 million people with that symbol on their back, it's going to charge that symbol very, very delicately. So we're trying to tease apart, where did this come from? And what I'm getting at here is, this isn't all for nothing, is occultism has been a very pregnant way of getting things done in politics, even after the separation of church and state. And so after the separation of church and state, where church shall have no authority over the rational mind, it was really this Enlightenment period where it was like the separation of the two at least allows you to be the human, and you can access any religion if you want, but it's not going to have like, I'm speaking for God and therefore I'm passing this law, which is beautiful. But where did all that power go? Some of it was killed off for sure, but a lot of it was pushed underground. So you'll see a lot of Knights Templar kind of mythology mixed in with what the Third Reich picked up. So you see a lot of occultism. And the main thing that I'm arriving at here is when you were saying prior to World War II, like, man, they were working on this crazy stuff in World War II. How did they know about this back then? What were they given? Were they given something from an extraterrestrial or subterranean race? And there's at least some work from Michael Tessarian who talks about Sir John Dee of the Tudor dynasty. He was, he was a sorcerer. He was an alchemist. He was dabbling in the mysteries and alchemy and working with chemicals, altered consciousness, staring into a scrying mirror, which is obsidian that was taken from Montezuma. Just weird stuff. But if you think about it, using what we would say today as being the modern pseudoscience, look into quantum physics, manifestation, all that kind of science, which there is a science around it, was being used in occultism and to access information that may have been accessible. And some, like Michael Tessarian, say that a lot of information that began to be worked on, like fission and fusion in the 1900s, that was stuff that was awoken inside of seances from Sir John Dee. So this is just a story. Obviously, there's so much context I won't go into it. But what I'm saying is there must have been some contact and access to higher information, because it wasn't all just people shivering in their thatch roofed huts back then. Well, we know there was some higher knowledge,
and we know the Nazis. I mean, obviously the famous Indiana Jones movie. The Nazis, or the Hunt for the Holy Grail, like that's based off of like the Nazis were really into this stuff. They were really going all over the world hunting rare artifacts and looking at ancient sites. And even if they didn't actually make contact with some actual off-planet intelligence, they just really were obsessed with this stuff. And so they were trying to recreate it, like we said, with no holds bar. I mean, they had no limitations. So if we're going to do a seance to try to do this, we'll do a seance. If we're going to throw some innocent guy into a chamber to test this, we'll do that. So there was nothing holding them back from, a mental, like, it was just do whatever you can to get some sort of scientific success. It was really the goal. We just want to outpace and have more power, control, and capability than our opponents. And a lot of times, war, this was at wartime, still was going on. So it's the biggest incentive. You're literally at war, so you're using all, look what countries do at wartime. They do amazing things. They come together, but also they can do amazingly horrible things, and so So let me finish this clip, and then we'll continue on this through line about World War II and the secrets, the UFO subject in general. Whoops, sorry. Let me switch to. Here we go.
Part of Vitkovsky's story that's very, very helpful, I think.
So this is just Farrell finishing, saying though that he believes, this one specific story about the bell, but doesn't put as much credence behind the Vril or the. He
specifically identifies various scientists that he thinks were involved with this project and why they were involved with it. With the Haunebu and Vril story, you don't have that. You've just got.
So he's just drawing a through line between the strong forensic evidence with the Bell story versus the Vril and the Haunebu story.
Pictures, which I think are probably photoshopped, and you've got diagrams that tell you exactly nothing about any of the physics that may have been involved.
That has always been my feeling. Like when you look into these other stories, and for anyone who's not quite aware, the Haunebu and Vril stories are more variations of German flying saucer type technologies that allegedly go back even decades before the rise of Hitler in some cases. And I've just never seen really strong evidence to work with to support it. If there was evidence, I would feel differently.
So that's just for people to kind of set the stage when it comes to that. Now, the next key thing that I want to show is now starting to show more of the German connection. starting to get near the end of World War II and starting to gain what we're talking about with paperclip and what was really going on. That and one of what he just is about to drop blew my mind. I wasn't really aware that this was going on with German elements, but this is all public knowledge, and people, please fact check, verify, go check out these things, because this is very much part of the process. We are on this journey together.
The things that not just
so actually 2236. All right.
Yes, there is this Nazi technology coming out of this. Now, I want to go back to the Bell and try and connect it to the secret space program breakaway civilization idea for a moment, because one of the things that not just Witkowski, but a number of other people have pointed out. Tom Augustin, a famous British journalist back in the 1980s, wrote, I think, the first book to come out and finger a particular entity in the Nazi Black Project structure that was responsible for a lot of this. Witkowski points out that all of this very ultra-secret research inside of the Third Reich was being done under the auspices of an entity called the Kammler Stab, the Kammler staff, named after an SS general that basically headed up, by the end of the war, all of the Third
everything.
Everything.
This is Hans Kammler you're talking about.
This is Hans Kammler. And we need to remember that Hans Kammler also drew up the plans for Auschwitz. In other words, this guy was also in charge of the SS Building and Works Department.
Did you know that
well, let's add play. This Hans Kammler guy is really critical. I'd never heard of this person before, but as Joseph is making the key point here, is he not only was involved in high levels of science and research and development within the Nazi Reich, but also came up with the idea of Auschwitz. And so he makes a point here that he also had this massive, massive ability to tap into pretty much an unlimited labor force, tens of millions of people to do whatever his bidding was, essentially.
He was a Nazi civil engineer and top secret weapons programmer.
Okay, beautiful. Yeah, there you go.
A labor pool of slave labor in the tens of millions. So this guy was an extremely powerful man. Well, the Kammler Stab, the way this gentleman, to use that term very loosely, set it up, was that, number one, he freed all of the scientists, technicians, and engineers from Nazi Party ideology. So in other words, he wasn't the slightest bit concerned, to keep
what their beliefs were, anything like that.
Right, exactly. He wanted to create a climate where they would literally brainstorm their technology trees and lay out the essential steps to get from here to there. He set up a private top secret magazine, if you want to call it that the scientists could circulate their papers to each other and kind of cross-fertilize their ideas. So in other words, what Kammler created was a Nazi version of Darpa. Okay, yeah. That's exactly what he did. And I do think that when Eisenhower sets up...
The key point right there is he creates a Nazi version of DARPA. So Defense Applications Research, basically our main defense department's area to do R&D into super covert type technology.
Which is where the internet eventually comes from.
Yeah, a lot of pretty bizarre things have come out of DARPA. It's a lot of sharp people. So you're starting to see more through lines, yeah. And you're starting to see certain elements. Oh, that's a good idea that they were doing in the Nazis. Why don't we do our own version? You start to see this sort of crossover more and more.
Precursor to ARPA, that in his thinking that they're modeling this on this Nazi entity, which is going to brainstorm all of this out of the box thinking. So I think that's one influence that comes here. You've got all the paperclip scientists that come over to Wright-Patterson down to Texas and so on and so forth. So I think there has been a significant influence. And
so Wright-Patterson, another key Air Force base to keep in mind, Wright-Patterson, Kirkland, Holloman, 3 really important Air Force bases within ufology.
I mentioned one of them that was connected with the Bell by the name of Dr. Kurt Debus, and this may intrigue you. Debus, after Roswell, the U.S. Army reopened his security file and re-vetted Dr. Debus for some reason. And at the time, it was suspected that these Germans were keeping their original command structure exactly in place and kind of reduplicating it inside of the American military-industrial complex. Well, Debus is...
So that's the little concern I was touching on earlier, that, it's once... You don't really just give up being a Nazi. Once you're a Nazi, you go, the only way out is in a coffin. And I don't know, I don't know if it was naivete or just sheer power hungry, why our government looked past that just because it was more important to get to space first and beat the Russians, or just because we wanted to have the best scientists in the world. And if we don't take them, then the Russians or somebody else will take them. But yeah, as he's saying here, there was a strong suspicion that there was a power structure that was maintained, that was already there in place within the Nazi Third Reich, that could have easily been maintained within various positions within our own governmental bodies in different capacities, from NASA to private contracting positions to DoD type, Pentagon, Darpa type positions as well.
Mm.
And I'm not sitting here making the argument, though, that like we completely got taken over by Nazis or anything like that. But this is just an important thing to just keep on your radar, is all I'm saying. And that's kind of how it is for me. I don't know exactly how that manifests or what that means, but it is a reality that I just think is too important to just not keep on our radar.
For sure.
Not a rocket scientist. I want to stress this. He's a high voltage plasma scientist. All right. He eventually ends up as the senior flight director for Project Apollo during the Apollo program at Cape Canaveral. So this guy is, the head honcho down there. And when he retires, just shortly before he retires, about 2 or 3 years before he did, he was placed by NASA as the head of NASA's UFO desk. And in addition, when he retired,
Fascinating.
Yeah, I found out about that just a couple of years ago, and I thought, oh, whoa, that's
Who is this? His name? I want to write this down. His name is
Kurt Debus, Kurt, and then the last name is Debus, Debus. Fascinating guy, very well known, and after he retires from NASA, he goes to work for a West German firm called OTROG, which stands for Orbital Rockets and Transport Aktiengesellschaft. And that company had a 250,000 square mile private preserve in the Congo.
Yeah, just let that sink in for a second. 250,000 square mile private reserve in the Congo. There's so many questions I have. But once again, okay, it is what it is.
Right.
This is a reality. Interesting.
I'm trying to visualize how large it is. That sounds immense.
That's huge. That's huge.
It's like a small nation.
It's a small nation. And, this is where the Germans are, this is the West German Area 51. And we wouldn't even know about this unless Mikhail Gorbachev had pointed this place out.
Exactly. So Gorbachev points this out, but this is basically the West Germans' version of Area 51. In the middle of the Congo, 250,000 miles, do what they want. So
wow,
you could do some pretty bizarre stuff and nobody would know about it.
And this was all operational when? During or post World War II?
Post World War II. Yeah, this is during the Cold War and Gorbachev.
Okay.
I don't know if he says this.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
So he was on the board of this corporation after he retired from NASA. So this guy, whatever he is, he's got his fingers in a whole lot of pies. So yeah, I think there's definitely some sort of influence here from this Nazi Black Projects Institute, the Kammler stuff, and post-war America. And it's intriguing to me that you find the same pattern. You've got von Braun with his rockets, which is kind of the public space program, if you want to put it that way. And then you've got the Kammler stuff doing all of this field propulsion, zero-point energy, and plasma research.
It's worth pointing out Hans Kammler just disappeared after the war.
Oh, yeah.
He was just gone. But unlikely he just died.
Oh,
it
no.
seems he went somewhere and just stayed very, very quiet.
Yeah.
And so that kind of touches a little bit on what you're saying too, Ben, about all these bizarre Nazis being found in Argentina and Patagonian mountains. And, there's the famous Hunting Hitler show on the History Channel, which you might disagree with the original premise, but when Tim Kennedy and I forget the other gentleman, all experts in what they do in intelligence and tracking and manhunting people, when they go to Argentina and they follow a lot of these trails from the Hitler bunker all the way there, I mean, they found, I'm blanking on the name of the town, but it's literally an entire German town, and they all speak German. They all are have a picture of their grandfather, and he's there's Nazi paraphernalia, and we're these are direct descendants of Nazis who had fled. And so it's kind of bizarre and it's weird. There's still this weird hush hush talking about what you can say and can't say, and people, I'm blanking. It's on the tip of my tongue, but yeah. So these are all parts you got to keep in mind, but what are
You
your
know, it's
thoughts just
funny.
after that?
Well, like, so I'm just on a Daily Mail link right now that said, did the U.S. fake top Nazis World War II suicide? And it's not even about Hitler. It's about Hans Kammler. And is basically saying, you know, the blood of thousands on his hands. He killed himself in 1945 in the dying days of Hitler's Germany. So like I'm sure there were a lot of these stories that came out where they were just like, well, come up with the narrative, put the narrative out, make sense of these numbers, and but let's not kill off these people that have vital information that we could probably mine. Now, that's probably the most beneficent idea on what the U.S. was thinking at the time. You know, let's be noble. Let's not kill them. Let's find what we can extract. So it's all for freedom, right? You know, can't kill off information and kill off people who have all this knowledge for freedom. But to kind of see where it just develops and how it develops afterwards. And the one of the most interesting things about that was really just this idea that what he said, you're a Nazi until you die. Like even your philosophy, like if you need to lie and pretend you're a part of NASA, you still are a Nazi. You still uphold whatever that was and whatever their, because I've heard a lot of different ideas about like what was the core philosophy, what were they really working towards, and what's your understanding on like the I know Jim Marrs did a really good book called The Fourth Reich. And he was talking about all of this. He was saying the Third Reich was supplanted, placed in the United States, and now a lot of the things, and this was years ago that I read this, saying a lot of the things that's happening in the United States right now are the things that happened to Nazi Germany in the decade leading up to World War II, and how that accelerated their mission, if you will, and that the mission didn't die. It was just supplanted and taken over here as well as throughout the world. But that the mission never died. So that's Jim Marrs, you know, rest in peace.
Yeah, RIP, he's a true OG and highly recommend his research in general because he covered a lot of things. You know, once again, like I said, like I got, that's when we get a little bit more into speculation. What we do know, like, is that there were serious power positions that were being held by former Nazis. Now, as far as like, I don't know specifically the occult of the SS and the Nazi as much. I feel that at that time, like I said, I don't know. You know, it's hard to know truly, like somebody like in particular Adolf Hitler, what his personal beliefs were because he was such a quiet guy. He really never it's very little known about his personal life, especially post sort of his rise to power. But essentially, it seems like there was some serious influence coming from certain occult elements. I mean, like we said, like they were spending serious money and resources, not on just building better tanks or better planes, but going to really bizarre places to find artifacts like the Holy Grail or I'm blanking on all the specific trips they did.
The spear that pierced
Destiny
Christ's side. Yeah,
and the cradle.
Also, Admiral Byrd, wasn't that connected?
Well, that comes right after the war, and we're about to touch on that too. Okay. And I'm going to play clips here about the Foo Fighters too that Farrell touches on. But it just, you know, I think there was probably a mixture within the Nazi Reich. Probably some guys were a little bit more into the occult and some guys weren't. But ultimately, they just did whatever boss said. And the boss was saying, like, I want you to build me an army that lasts tens of thousands of years and had this very bizarre half man, half god type of image. You know, they really were into glorifying themselves to be something more than human. You know, even the way they filmed Ava von Braun, the way they filmed things, it was revolutionary in cinematography to be looking up at people while they destroyed statues. You know, obviously horribly evil people, but they were really good at marketing. They were really good at putting on a show. Like, they knew how to brainwash. They knew how to convince thousands of people to something. I watched this amazing documentary, and a lot of people at the time within mainland Germany had no idea what was really going on with the horrors of Auschwitz. I'm not going to say all of them, and I'm not going to, I'm not sitting here making excuses, but a lot of them, they really did just like say, like, focus on the fairy tales and this ancient sort of Bavarian fairy tales and these fantasies, and they would create these sort of festival type, parades and the marches. It was all very theatrical. And in a lot of ways, Hitler was a thespian. I mean, he was an artist. He was a thespian. He was this really extroverted introverted thespian dude who would do these really intense uppers and knew how to sell a point. But the bottom line is, like, it was this really bizarre, like, when you really understand the context of what these people thought there, it makes you understand how they got played, essentially. And it's not to like say like it's okay what they did. I'm not doing that, but like there was a lot of like Goebbels and propaganda and the things they did. Like it was pretty ingenious. They created propaganda in a lot of ways, and then we, like I said, we took a lot of stuff they did and we're like, hey, let's use some of the propaganda skills. And Edward Bernays took certain things from Goebbels, and you start to see crossovers. But I want to get deeper into the stuff that you're showing, but I just want to touch base on that like we're very good at looking back into history and saying, you know what I would have done differently. And really, a lot of us would say, like, yeah, if I were in that situation, I would just tell them what I think. And we have this idea of like how noble and brave we would be in certain situations, but we don't sometimes catch the nuances. Like, for one, World War I was pretty devastating on Germany. So you're talking about, we as Americans, we don't understand devastation happening just a decade or two ago. We don't understand what that does to the cultural psyche, how it changes society's mindset towards what we want to rebuild and we want to protect against. And here's this person that's promising me safety. Maslow's hierarchy of needs is being met. Like, I feel safe at this point. And so, you have this very charismatic person in a rise to power. Is a very nuanced situation. And also what we do today, it's just different. We have limited liability to where it's like legally, well, it's like, oh, it's not that company's fault. And yeah, we can slap them on the wrist, but who's going to pay the biggest price? Well, the insurance companies. And there's this limited liability thing to where we don't have a Hitler to focus on, because every 4 to 8 years our presidents are out, so we don't have this massive archetype, but we use all of the same propaganda, we use all of the same tactics in, well, let's champion really good causes. Like, did you know Hitler was also a vegetarian, and he was talking about like stamping out I think it was smoking cigarettes or something back in those days. And there were a bunch of points that, like, if you were to just talk about those points and not say who they came from, you'd be like, oh, that sounds like a pretty good candidate for a politician. And then you mention who it is, and you'd be like, oh, I didn't say that. I would never say that would be a good candidate, because we don't realize that in those days it was a very different world. Yeah, even America matters. In those days it was a very different world. So context matters so much, and I think that's just overall is a big thing that's been lost in today's world. Like, when did we lose context? When did everything become just like, and this happens a lot with stand-up comedians, and I don't want to tangent here, but like this is why we're providing context for everyone right now with this unidentified aerial phenomenon. It's so critical for people to have context, historically speaking, to have a little bit more sense of what's happening in the present and where we're going, or else we're going to repeat the mistakes, and so, yeah, and in today's world, it's amazing how much nuance and context has sort of been left out, when it's now like almost more needed than ever, when we have so much information coming at us, when we need to be vetting information better than ever personally and critically thinking and all these things, and really being trained. And I think that's part of your mission and the mission of the show in general is just like training better critical thinking, independent thinking, and challenging, logic and Socratic method without taking it personal and just saying, hey, I'm not attacking you, and make that known, and that's cool. But like, let's just hold up the merit of an idea and think it through. And if you believe this and I believe this, and let's weigh that proportionally in an honest, upfront way. And with this subject, the UAP subject, that's what we're trying to do. And providing this context is critical for people to then, when you say something like, oh, maybe there is this secret space program going on, if you don't have any context about that, it's easy to write it off and ridicule it and go, that sounds completely crazy. But when you look at certain experiments already happening in the 40s and 50s and certain things, throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and little drips from people like Lockheed Skunk Works and Ben Rich and various people in serious positions of power who would be in the know saying certain things, or astronauts saying strange things, or pilots, you then start to say, okay, maybe that original idea isn't as bizarre or out there as I thought when I have more context for it.
Yeah. And appreciate you for saying that, because a lot of what we're doing with the historical context is showing you that it doesn't even just start in World War II. No. And, perhaps in a later episode, I'll get deeper into how different theories lead me into research that keeps coming back to this. There's the mud flood theory, even the flat earth theory. When I started looking into it, they're very, very much so interested in anything that's coming out about what's happening in outer space, contact. It's really interesting. And that's what I love about all of this. It's tying in different things that I'd heard about history, and it is providing context. And it's also very much so helping with understanding. We were talking about the German or Darpa. And when you understand what our DARPA is, it's not devoid of contacts with the Nazis, and then also DOD and MIT and Boston College and all of these things that have led to what the internet is today, which is the primary way that we're spreading the information and the narratives about what's coming out, disclosure next month. So, I mean, all of this at least has to be seen in context, so we can start, in a sense, standing in awe of, we've been cutting down the tallest poppy so we could get to the most homogenous narrative for too long. It's time to take a look at those poppies that we cut down and start seeing the patterns between them. So let's go ahead and dive in.
Yeah, and I'm going to dive in. One other thing I want to add that I think is important with all this too is, look, part of any especially controversial or cutting edge thing is you're going to have certain times people who consciously or unconsciously hurt the movement. And part of all this is also just keeping our eye on the ball, not throwing the baby out with the bathwater and saying, all this is BS, all this is just bull, because one person led me astray and threw me off. And there have been people, unfortunately, in this industry who have basically been, whether it's misinformation or disinformation, the level of was it on purpose or by accident and all the motives. We don't need to get into that, but it does exist. So a big part of this too, that I've learned, just like anything, you have to really do your due diligence and say who really has stood the test of time. What information has really stood the test of time? Who really is a seriously credible researcher who has really hardcore forensic objective evidence, as if I was a investigative journalist or a lawyer arguing this in a court of law, is how I really try to approach this. And so I'm cool and I'm down to speculate on certain out there things, but we always got to be honest, we're speculating, and we also have to call a spade on a spade when we say, what are your thoughts on this or this certain person? Like, for instance, like we just did with the Vril stuff. Like, it's interesting, it's out there, but it's harder to prove that versus this. We have this actual Nuremberg testimony and forensic evidence to back it up.
It is just interesting to note that occultism is never not present. Yeah. And it's always super intricately tied to many of these agendas, overtly sometimes, a lot of it's covertly, but there is something to at least understand as like a footnote to all of this evidence, is that occultism is always there, and there's always the priesthood behind the scenes that really does have an ear to the emperor. So yeah, man.
All right, so this next clip is just touching on a little bit more specifically when we refer to Foo Fighters. And then we're going to get to
Since you mentioned Foo Fighters, I think in some cases they were encountering some sort of German technology, but not in all cases. And this is the problem. We have become trapped, I think, in ufology into thinking that, well, they've got to be one or the other.
This is Super Beats.
Sorry. So it's a little bit confusing when he says, I think some were German and some weren't, because my understanding he was just saying is the ones they had weren't able to even do the kind of things that these Foo Fighters were doing. So that's just one little thing I'll just put for full disclosure, specifically if there's more advanced craft they created after that original version. That's a little bit confusing point there.
Forgetting the possibility that it could be a both and rather than an either or.
For the record, though, I do think Foo Fighters were just straight up not anything man-made when you look at what these things look like and what they were doing.
There are some cases that I think clearly indicate that they were dealing with some sort of German technology. We don't know exactly what it was. And then the other problem is you've got cases of these things appearing in the Pacific. You've got you've got cases where in the Pacific, interestingly enough, where these things are attacking both Japanese and Allied craft. And if that's the case, well, the Germans are not going to attack their ally if it's German. And in Europe, you've got the same thing. So I think you have to hold open the possibility that you're looking at some other player on the field, be it.
And I think a key thing to note there is attacking craft. that's one of the only few instances or cases I've ever heard where craft were actually attacked. They're always very peaceful, and I don't know specifically if this is just the pilot shooting at them and they just, didn't fire back, but I do believe, and somebody could fact check this, I do believe 1 or 2 pilots might have died trying to fight a potential Foo fighter. But that is an interesting thing to note, because most encounters, there's no shooting back from any type of craft. All of our objects and projectiles seem to bounce and do no harm to the vehicles.
Extraterrestrial, crypto-terrestrial, whatever you want to call it, besides whoever's behind the Nazi version of this. I just don't. My other problem with people that want to write all of this off to Nazi technology or human technology is that there are too many of these incidents. And as far as I can tell, Richard, the problem with the human version of this technology is it is extremely expensive and very difficult to engineer. So if we are going to just on a cost analysis basis alone attempt to explain all of this as human technology, we'd be bankrupt. I just don't see it as a possibility. It's just too much.
That'll give us an opportunity to talk about some of the secret spending on what is going on with our mutual friend Catherine Austin Fitz, who's gotten into it. But thank you for that answer. By the way, the problem of the sheer quantity of these UFO reports, that's also been used to argue against the extraterrestrial hypothesis for basically the same reason. People say there's thousands of these reports every year. Do we honestly think that this is going to be aliens from another planet surveilling us and checking us out in this mass? And that is a problem when you think about it that way. However you look at it, it seems to me there's a massive infrastructure that is behind this, and that's a heck of a thing to contemplate. Look,
So that's a key thing he points out there is, there seems to be most likely, it would stand to reason there would have to be some sort of pretty massive infrastructure, whether this is all some sort of covert program or, the off-world, hypothesis. But, so what are some of your thoughts just from that takeaway?
Well, yeah, no, I felt the same thing. I really like just how practical it is to look at the money and look at how would something like this practically get done, so there perhaps, and here's the thing that starts to come into question here is, so with these Foo Fighters, who was it connected to? Were there humans understanding of what they were, or connected to where the Foo Fighters came from? And, because as we're starting to see, when we're talking about a lot of this stuff, I even had to look up what crypto-terrestrial was. And really the only thing that came up was the interdimensional hypothesis. Like Bigfoot. And so, well, yes, and the, I don't know that this is crypto-terrestrial. But when it gives me interdimensional hypothesis, it's saying, is an idea of advanced ufologists such as Jacques Vallée, that says unidentified flying objects and related events involve visitations from other realities or dimensions. And so that kind of gets into something that maybe in another episode we can touch base on, which is the concept of hyperdimensional beings. The fact that Imperial College London is putting people in extended state DMT so they can connect with these creatures that everyone is saying on DMT they're having encounters with, these highly intelligent, insectoid, sometimes crystalline, light-bodied, disembodied intelligences that are vastly more intelligent than we are. And they're not just godly and benevolent. Sometimes they're tricksters, sometimes they're actually malevolent, and sometimes they're just annoyed at your presence. So these are just other dimensions of what are we talking about here? And I think there's something about that must get into what I was saying with Sir John Dee, tapping into interdimensional stuff. But, without going there, I actually want to stay on the more practical side and start getting into the black budget stuff. Where did the secret space program, if there was such a thing, really get its funding? Is that what Catherine Austin Fitz found when there was $20 what is it, $20 trillion missing from the Pentagon. Like, whoops, where does that go?
Yeah.
How do you describe $20 trillion going missing? And how did that get described? These are all questions that we could answer. It doesn't have to be answered right now, but I want to get into that so the audience understands. Like, there are some practical things. It's not just a bunch of people saying, well, that could, like, you know, this symbol is also found here, which must prove that they were in cahoots. So no, we're talking about there's actual money that went missing, and we know about DUMBs or deep underground military bases. We've heard about these things, but most of us, it doesn't get past the, oh, I've heard about it phase. We don't go deeper into it. So let's dive in.
Okay, so I have Operation Highjump as well. Mm-hmm. That was a critical thing. And as far as the Secret Space Program, honestly, it is probably a whole episode in and of itself. And so I think I'm down, and I've got it ready. We're gonna have to do a whole episode just on that, and that's kind of what I was planning on. And I have a teaser at the end for it. But where the money, this $21 trillion is going, is kind of part of what we're hitting on right now. And I think this is also tied into that, and it's critical. So this idea of the deep underground military bases, the idea of, the build out of these early programs that we're referring to. So the two key things that I wanted to hit on before we jump to Secret Space Program for this episode, though, that I think are critical for context, is just Operation Highjump is a big one that comes up historically speaking. And then the Eisenhower alleged ET meeting at Holloman Air Force Base is another critical one that we have clips on. And then there's the MAJIC document, the Majority Agency Joint Intelligence document, that is controversial, that has recent Bob Woods and Lyndon Moulton Howard helped to do some verification of the authenticity of this famous document, whether the typewriter was actually the one used at Kirkland's, and verifying the letters and the way they're printed and things like that. But it is a controversial document. But if you're cool with basically just giving the context up to basically the Secret Space Program, and then we'll kind of give a teaser at the end, and then I think we're just gonna have to dedicate a whole show just to that, because just the historical context alone is a lot. And I want to just make sure people fully grok and kind of grasp that first. So one thing that has a little bit of debate, and actually I've gone back and forth, but I'm kind of in agreement now about Operation Highjump is what exactly happened, and what is Operation Highjump, and who is Admiral Byrd. And this is kind of right after World War II. You have Operation Paperclip. You have the development of some of these early programs like the CIA, coming out of the Office of Naval Intelligence. You have all these restructuring and reforming of the armed services in general. And part of, while that's all going on, a little bit later, is this famous incident that people really point to as one of the most important historical incidents in ufology, that I just want to give people a little bit of context about, because I do think it's critical with where we currently continue to go to the present. So this is Farrell breaking it down about what exactly happened at Operation Highjump and his best guess, because it's not concrete with what exactly happened, as you'll find out.
I'm curious about is the extent of activity going on in Antarctica. I guess I'll just throw out the first possibility here. I actually think that there is some very interesting things about Antarctica going on today.
So Antarctica, like the southwest of the United States with Area 51 and these kind of places, is one of the places that a lot of speculation has been about where potentially activity or anything's going on. But this is just leaning towards this specific event. And they'll kind of touch on modern day reasons why Antarctica is still a little bit weird as well.
But there are a number of reasons that I think that there's important covert things happening there. Yes. But the Byrd mission. So for people who don't know, this is Admiral Richard Byrd goes to Antarctica at the end of 1946, beginning 1947, for an operation known as Highjump. It's a huge operation. And then it's terminated early. A couple of people did die. And Byrd makes a very cryptic statement to, I believe, a Chilean newspaper.
El Mercurio. Mm-hmm.
So can you unpack this whole thing for listeners? And I would love to know what you think happened for Operation Highjump.
All right. I talk about it in my most recent book, Hess and the Penguins. That's kind of my latest word on Antarctica. Number one, let's look at who has been involved or associated with Antarctica. Let's go back to the German expedition of 1938 and 1939 that was sponsored by Reichsmarshal Hermann Goering. All right. Now, I'm of the opinion that Hermann Goering is not interested in a science fair project. I mean, this is the guy that's the founder of the Luftwaffe. He's the founder of the Gestapo. He's in charge of Germany's 4-year economic plans. So he does not have a purely altruistic, purely science reason for doing this, whatever it is that they were doing, which we don't know.
Right.
Again, you have the Patriarch of Moscow recently, Kirill III, going down ostensibly to bless the Orthodox chapel down there, which, okay, fine, but you can get any Orthodox bishop to do that. You don't need the Patriarch of Moscow to go all the way down there and do that. You had Secretary of State John Kerry making a little Antarctic junket on a diplomatic tour.
It was one of the last things he did as Secretary of State?
Yeah, in the middle of one of the most hotly contested elections in American history, and he decides to go Antarctica, and we were told that, well, he wanted to see evidence of climate change firsthand. Well, no, I'm sorry.
Seriously, John Kerry, come on.
Yeah, come on. You're the Secretary of State for crying out loud. You're
not
in
a
charge
chance.
of Foggy Bottom. You can get mountains of data with a phone call delivered to your office. You don't need to go there. Then you had Buzz Aldrin. You've got Lockheed Martin has a presence.
Buzz Aldrin, he's a loose cannon every now and then. You never know what's going to come out of the mouth of Buzz Aldrin. Seriously.
Yeah, before he goes down there, he says, getting ready to go to the launch pad. And I'm thinking, whoa, stop there, Buzz. And then he gets down there. He gets sick. They have to take him out. And then supposedly he tweets, well, whatever we're dealing with down here is pure evil.
And then it's eliminated. The tweet is taken out.
And then it's eliminated. Yeah. It
like, whoops.
Yeah, so there's a lot of strange stuff in Antarctica. We're not being told of what's going on. So Admiral Byrd goes down there in late 46, 47. It's a massive expedition. I mean, it dwarfs the German expedition.
So this is right after the war. So I forgot exactly all the timelines and everything, but this is right after 45. The war ends. 46. Admiral Byrd's doing this. So everything's still very fresh, so to speak.
Expedition. And he's taking with him an aircraft carrier, a seaplane tender, a submarine, for a flotilla of destroyers or destroyer escorts, and a battalion of Marines. And the story that the government puts out is, well, we know that the Arctic could become a theater in the next war, so we need to test our equipment and our tactics. And I'm thinking, wait a minute. Why on earth wouldn't you go to Alaska or northern Canada, which are much closer to hand, and save yourself the expense of sending an entire fleet down to Antarctica? And then, on top of this, I discovered that the people involved with the planning for Highjump, are you sitting down, Richard?
I am indeed.
Were Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz. Yeah.
Wow. Top of the line.
And Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal. That's a little ding, ding, ding.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed.
So that's where James Forrestal comes up again. So he's involved with Operation Highjump in a major way with the planning and facilitation of it. And as I touched on earlier, Forrestal is a major figure within ufology, one of the early core people that a lot of people believe would have access, would have knowledge of this subject, would actually have seen actual physical craft if we had it, or physical bodies if we have them. This is the gentleman who would be in the know without a doubt. First Secretary of Defense. And he's also one of the people, if you are in the group that believes the MAJIC 12 document, was also the co-founder, one of the key co-founders of MAJIC, MJ12. So he's just a key name to keep in mind, because we're going to bring him up next as well.
Indeed. So he goes down there, and then this expedition is outfitted, supposedly, to stay there for 8 months. And he calls it off after 8 weeks. He hightails it back. He gives a statement to El Mercurio that the United States is going to have to prepare to defend itself against enemy fighters that can fly from pole to pole at tremendous velocity or something like this. And that's all we hear about it. And then, Byrd appears on the CBS show for a half-an-hour stint, writes a big article for National Geographic, and that's all we hear of Highjump. Now, the Nazi UFO people have always been saying that he really went down there to take out the secret Nazi UFO research base in Antarctica.
Mm-hmm. And got his butt handed to him.
And lost. Yes, exactly. Yeah. And folks, I'm sorry. Number one, the stories, as I said earlier, of Hanabu and Vril and these Nazi field propulsion flying saucers are put out after the war by a group of neo-Nazis in Vienna and Munich. That story is simply hogwash. The only indicator that we have that they were working on something like that is the Bell story, and the details of the Bell story do not support that idea. because number one, the bell is not maneuverable. Number two, it kills the people that it comes into close contact with. And number three, let us not forget, it has to have an entire power plant in the locality.
That's right.
To provide direct current electricity for this dang thing. So what they're basically maintaining is we would have to have a facility like that down there in order for there to be a secret Nazi UFO base in Antarctica to kick Admiral Byrd's butt out of Antarctica. So no, I don't believe these stories. Now,
and by the way, if Byrd had suffered a military defeat, he would have lost way more than. I mean, there were a couple of people who died. It wasn't like this huge catastrophe.
No, it was not. It was not. It was a plane that went down. At some point, the crewmen were left out and they couldn't find their location and so on and so forth. They froze to death. So,
So what do you think? What happened with Highjump? What was the? What's your take on what Byrd encountered? And
well, if they did,
why did he say what he said?
Yeah, if they did encounter anything German, it would have had to have come from Patagonia in Argentina, which is quite a ways away.
That's right.
I think they did encounter something, but we simply have no idea of what it was, or they found something, and that explanation also, I think, has some currency given everybody else that's been down there, given Lockheed Martin's presence, given the strange reports, a few years ago from the Russians at Lake Vostok. They may have found something, or they may have. This was a photogrammetry mission to fly over the continent and take pictures and map it, just like the German expedition. So they may have found something there.
So that's the key. So that's kind of the key rundown of what happened with Operation Highjump. Obviously, this massive operation. They come back way earlier than they're supposed to. A few people have died. There's this very strange statement made to a Chilean newspaper by Admiral Byrd. And the best theory that I concur with Farrell there is they found something. Now, the other big theory, as he pointed out there, is that there was actually a Nazi base there that had been in development, possibly started of the war even before it. But that's harder to prove and doesn't have as much credence. So there has been a continued weirdness about Antarctica to this day, as they pointed out, of like possibility of ancient structures, maybe related to things like Atlantis or things of that nature, if you believe in the notions of that. So it's weird, are there strange ancient pyramids or things there, or certain beings? That's kind of the nuts and bolts of Operation Highjump, and just a good breakdown for context for people, because it is an important event for people to be aware of.
Yeah, and that gave way to instantly after that in Antarctica, 1947 and 1948 was Operation Windmill. And so so Operation Highjump was supposed to be an 8-month thing. Yeah. And after 8 weeks, called the kibosh on it. He goes back and he gives that statement, which was basically saying there's going to be, planes from the poles, in potential wartime situation, that there's this power. So but in Operation Windmill that starts up, they were doing interesting things. As I'm reading here, the mission during Operation Windmill was including supply activities. So they're bringing supplies down, helicopter reconnaissance of ice flows, scientific surveys, but this last one, underwater demolition surveys. And I saw that come up in a couple other things that I was pulling up. In the underwater demolition surveys, I'm not sure if they were trying to destroy something there or like a base. But I get to this other U.S. Navy Second Antarctic Developments Project, this Operation Windmill. They were also instructed to investigate conditions of electromagnetic propagation and to collect geographic, hydrographic, oceanographic, geologic, and meteorologic information in that nature of electromagnetic propagation. And they were even taking like penguins and seals and different kinds of creatures there for zoonotic exploration, potentially by what some of this I believe that I've picked up on is in the same way we take ice core samples, or you can cut a tree down and you can see in its rings a story about the past. They were looking to do the same things with, since there's not much in the forms of like plant life there, the actual creatures there, they were taking and trying to figure out something about the electromagnetic properties around the pole. So that's just stuff that I just pulled up here. And there was another one, so there was Operation Windmill. And let's see if I can get back to it. But then there was another one right afterwards.
Yeah. And Farrell does mention that. He says, they have a couple operations right after, and there's not like some major event and tragedy that happens. So it makes you kind of lean towards specifically when they went and where they went. Maybe they encountered something. And why would this serious admiral even make that statement initially to the Chilean newspaper? Because then he doesn't say as much, and maybe he was told to shut up type thing. But why would you even, you know? So it's weird, and it's just important context. You know,
here's exactly what he said. Here's exactly what he said to the paper. Admiral Richard E. Byrd warned today that the United States should adopt measures of protection against the possibility of an invasion of the country by hostile planes coming from the polar regions. The admiral explained that he was not trying to scare anyone, but the cruel reality is that in case of a new war, the United States could be attacked by planes flying over one or both poles. So, you know, that's an interesting, so this is, Admiral Byrd, not just some crackpot,
Well, it's weird, and it's weird he uses the term planes versus like UFO or flying saucer.
Right.
So like, is there a landing strip? I mean, we would see that with satellites and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, so this is another important one that's part of ufology history that's critical. And so then after the war, you have Eisenhower as the initial launch clip we have warning about the military-industrial complex. And it kind of makes you think like, how much is this sort of a veiled warning to us about what he might know is going on with these unrestricted sort of runaway private contractors and various people within the government who are involved in these programs that, maybe he was directly, and his daughter has come out and spoke publicly about this, Laura, basically like, if you're the president and you know that you've helped create something that is also leading to basically an unaccountable level, this idea of deep state or, this branch of the government that's unelected and unaccountable, that has a lot of power and a lot of influence that you've been by accident maybe helping create. It kind of seems like he was sort of in a way warning us, but also in a way maybe burdened and felt a little bit of regret, and so it's interesting. But essentially what is also a major thing that I think is just critical to put on people's radar, and once again, look at the evidence, decide for yourself, but is the fact that did Eisenhower actually have a meeting with a UFO that landed on Holloman Air Force Base in 1955? If that is legitimate, and what these witnesses say, and I'll show you the clip, and that's true, that is a major, 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 major deal, because not only does it mean that UFOs are real and help more give credence to that, and that they're not just, something covert being made, we actually then, at the highest level at the time, actually made contact with them to some degree. And so I'll play the clip, but like, that's a much different thing than just being, oh, they're here and we don't know where they are. To actually have some sort of dialogue. We don't know how it happened specifically and anything like that. You'll see here, but that's a big piece to this whole puzzle with disclosure as things start to come out. And I would put my money on it. That is, with June and as things come out, as the government tells us more, I guarantee you they don't want us to know or to be in the know about like, oh, we've actually had meetings and potentially like dialogue with these beings before. That would be something that people are like, well, what? Why did that's something that we should have been filled in on. That's something you shouldn't have done without us. Like, so let me play.
Catherine Austin Fitz has some stories about having been told in government, would you like to have a meeting with an extraterrestrial? And she didn't believe it at the time, and she didn't have that meeting. But when you're mentioning about Dwight Eisenhower, I've spoken with Laura twice so far. Once was at a Free Your Mind conference in Philadelphia, and then another one was in an interview at the beginning of 2020. And this was right after I had learned about this meeting. And what's so funny is, so we'll let you get on with this so the audience has context of what I'm saying, but I learned about this whole thing through a QAnon video. And so I was sent QAnon videos, and I went and I learned about some connections here that were actually, and this is why I don't diss looking into things that even may seem stupid on the face of them, because you'll learn about certain historical things that they're referencing that I'm like, I did not know that. And that clarifies things in other fields. But there's something about a yellow cube, a translucent yellow or orange cube that Dwight Eisenhower, according to some accounts, was given as a technology that was then reverse engineered. And then there was Enrico Fermi, who started working on the
Fermi paradox.
No, it's called the chronovision and a chronovisor. Right. And I thought it was so funny is because this was at the beginning of the coronavirus virus. And when I was learning about it, I was like, coronavirus. You just change one letter around. And then I was like, okay, that's just my apophenia kicking in. But so it sounds by the look of it like you didn't you hadn't heard of the yellow cube. Had you heard of that?
No, I haven't found any hard evidence of any witnesses or any forensic evidence saying that he has that. Lauren might have something personal that she has evidence of that I'm not familiar with. Okay. And I think it's a good little moment to realize, look, man, like when you really start to study a lot of these things in these worlds of sort of the covert and things that are in the worlds of the shadow, when you understand people like Richard Doty and the Mirage Men, like how disinformation works, how misinformation works, really good disinformation is usually 80-85% true, 15% false. And it's just that 15% or 20% that really will throw you off. Because if you're throwing completely absurd things out to people, then they're going to immediately at face value go, okay, I'm not even going to give that the time of day because it seems ridiculous.
The whole thing.
Yeah, but if you sprinkle in, hey, Eisenhower actually, there's a good chance did actually have this meeting with ETs, then you go, wow, and then you look into it, that's actually legit. And then you throw in the next thing, oh, and he also, something really out there that's just completely absurd. You will also maybe digest and believe the second part as well. And that's sort of the whole psychology behind how do you a psyop, psychological operations, and all these kind of things. But basically, and that's look, straight up, for a minute, I was a little bit into the queue, and I was like, this, like very early on, and I had a good friend of Gaia, and she and I I was really following, like, this is interesting, because I do know a lot about this, and like, this is interesting, but then I would see things where I'm like, oh no, like, that's a big red flag, I don't agree with that, and so
it was
then
a false awakening.
Sorry?
To me, Q and Flat Earth is a false awakening, and I have to be very careful by saying that because they're necessary. But I think we're going to have a couple more of these things that are so right on, and they wake people up in many ways. But the overall thing is co-opted, whether it's co-opted by a singular source or it's co-opted by our projection and wanting it to be something more than it actually is. And both, every theory, even correct theories, have that. We want closure on what's happening out there. Right. The thing about the orange cube, the only thing I'll say before we hop into it is when I started thinking of, well, what would that orange cube mean about anything? He was given this cube and the military tried reverse engineering it, but it was used to project onto like a screen a visual imagery of stuff that's happened in the past and of probabilities of the future. And so when they actually got down to these other, like Enrico Fermi, and there was other experimenters trying to reverse engineer it, they came up with the chronovisor. That was this thing that they said they were able to peer back into specific moments in history. Now, I know I'm probably losing a ton of people, but also able to see visualized potential future outcomes. Right. But it had to do with how much the people who saw it actually believed in it as to whether it would actually come true as a future event. That to me sounds like what quantum computing is today. I mean, it sounds exactly
this is the type of tech to where it's easy to dismiss, but when we start to talk about what would these kind of beings that are this much more advanced, their type of tech look like, it would look like the stuff that sounds like magic to us, right? Just like an iPhone looks like magic to somebody 200 years ago or 100 years ago, right? And so it's hard to prove that, and we can't say it, but if you had something that was integrated with consciousness, like we talked about with Adam Curry, that's a way more advanced version of it. Apparently these craft are actually synced with our consciousness, and what you think the craft integrates and moves that way. And just our such a rudimentary understanding of consciousness in general.
Look at drones today. There are people controlling it with their mind, moving it around. So that's just to your point.
But the potential to see probable timelines, like we do forecasting, but to do it in a visual way, like I've had precognition in dreams that really trip me out, where like I'd never been to this place before, I'd never been with this person before, and then I meet this new person in this new place, and it literally like it syncs up the dream with reality, and it's this really weird feeling of like, I dreamt this exact thing, I said that, you said that, and that happened. And I've always felt like what I'm seeing in my dream is a potential probability of a future timeline. And it's not necessarily going to come true, but if the right variables add up, then it's like a 90-95% chance of coming true. And the more I do a certain variable, it gets closer to almost 100%. So I don't know exactly what's going on, and there's these weird phenomena we can experience naturally, and ideas like intuition and Dean Radin and instant and noetic sciences. They're really on the cutting edge of like creating pragmatic tech and ways to measure these phenomena in a way that, you know, in 50, 100, 1,000 years from now could look like the tech you're talking about, where it just looks like a cube, but, you know, it would make sense. You know, this is what in sci-fi movies, this is all kind of how it leads. It's this small, tiny device that's seamless that does this amazing thing. So, and so that's where it's important for this historical context for us to then have a better idea of how do we extrapolate? How do we know where we're going? Well, we look at what we currently know exists. So let's dive
into the Eisenhower stuff.
Yeah, Eisenhower. As I said, this is a big deal. And so the gentleman here, there's two clips I want to show. The gentleman here, it's a pseudonym, so it's not his real name for, you know, privacy reasons and security. Kirkland, he was a Air Force medic at Holloman Air Force Base in 1955 when this whole alleged Air Force One landing and everything occurs. So I'll let this kind of just like speak for itself. But it's pretty convincing once you hear these two testimonies.
Eisenhower is going to land one day, and in the winter, February, Holloman Air Force Base has got a code that unless in the wintertime everything is normally khakis. Unless you're doing base operations work and are an officer of an official standing on the base, then you wear blues. That's in the wintertime. So the story that I'm telling you, the difference between khakis and blues is very important. When Eisenhower was supposed to land, or come in, the day before he was to come in, a parade to honor him was canceled. The President of the United States is entitled to full military honors at any base that he lands on. And that means a parade. Dr. Reiner asked me if I wanted to go to the parade, and I said no. He said, okay, you're working. Well, the work schedule of Eisenhower didn't show up. The parade didn't show up. So I just went to work like normal. And when I went there was a nurse who worked there that said, Kirkland, where's Dorsey? Dorsey Moore was the airman in charge of our little group. He wasn't an officer, he was an airman. And I said, I don't. And just then Dorothea Thorenson, who was our clerk typist, said, I saw him take his wife down to the commissary. He'll be back in about 15 or 20 minutes. I just kept quiet after that, you know. When Dorsey came in about 15 minutes later, he said, Kirkland, did you see what's out at on the flight line? I said, what is it? He says, it's a disc, hovering disc. I'm thinking disc that you can throw, 12 inches maybe, wooden with a steel rim. The only thing that I knew that hovered other than that was a helicopter and the Navy's hovercraft. And I'm saying, oh, I said, what's it made of? He says, metal, like polished aluminum, polished steel. He said, you know, metal. I said, how big is it? He said, 20 to 30 feet. I said, no, I haven't seen it. He said, you want to see it? I said, yes. I said, I'd like to see it. He said, go out to the front of the hospital, he says, and look down at the flight line. He said, you'll see it. I said, with my luck, I said, I would go out there and it wouldn't be there. He said, I wouldn't say that. He says, I took my wife to the commissary. It was there 30 minutes later when I left. And I said, well, I'll ask. In a base where there's war conditions, regardless of where you're at, you're on 24/7. And if you leave your assigned spot, that's against the law, military law. So I asked the nurse who had asked the doctor if I could go out to the front and see it. She looked at the doctor, and the doctor said no, so I didn't go. 9 o'clock, go for coffee. Coming back from coffee, I'm following two young pilots. The one on the left is in khakis, the one on the right is in blues. The one on the left said, why the blues? He says, I'm the officer of the day. He says, I've been down at base ops all day. He said, waiting for the plane to come in. He said, Air Force One? He said, yes. Air Force One, that was the first time I heard Air Force One. I didn't know what it meant. I had to ask that too. Well, in the 60s, that was very common, but in the 40s, it was the first time I heard it. He said, well, what happened? He said, he landed, he turned around on the active and shut down. And we were told to turn off our radar. Why were you told to turn off your radar? I don't know. He said, we were told to turn it off, so we turned them off.
So to clarify here.
And the guy in the khaki said, I heard that the one that was brought down at Roswell.
So to clarify here, Eisenhower landed, they say. They were told to turn off the radar tower because you'll see a little bit here later, they're afraid of maybe interference, as he says right here.
Well, was brought down with Doppler radar.
It says, I heard the one at Roswell was brought down with Doppler radar. So these are the two pilots walking, and he's walking behind them on Holloman Air Force Base. That same day, that same morning, he's walking behind these two gentlemen talking about this, and he's just listening as he's walking right behind them.
And he said, I don't know. They continued talking. What happened after that? He said, they came out over the mountains across the proving ground, White Sands Proving Ground, across the monument, and the guy on the left, again, the khaki guy said, I heard one landed at the monument. He said, the other one said, I don't know about that. I'm telling you what I saw. He says, two of them came over. One landed on the reactive in front of the plane, and the other one hovered overhead like it was protecting that plane.
Now he's referring to the two craft. One lands at Holloman Air Force Base, right next to the Air Force One, and the other one is basically hovering above what they theorize for protection reasons.
He got out of his plane, walked to the UFO, and the door opened, and he walked inside. How long?
President Eisenhower, that's what they're referring to. Got out of his plane, walked to the UFO, and they opened the door, and he got in. It's a huge statement. That's a really big deal if this is true, but this is just, you guys got to believe the witnesses here, and I think these people did really work there, and all that forensic evidence to back up what they're saying is true. So, but this is just, we really got to take the word of the witnesses.
How long was he in there? About 40 or 45 minutes. Could you see? Were they grays? He says, I couldn't see. I didn't have
Eisenhower's in there almost 45 minutes.
binoculars. Who had the binoculars? The tower. Could they see? No, they didn't have the angle. This is all going on while I'm walking behind them, probably no more from here to the lobby area. And as they were doing this, one of them said, did you see, the one on the left again, did you see the autopsy film? And the one on the right said, yes. Do you think it's real? I don't know. So it was available in 55.
And the autopsy film they're referring to there is the extraterrestrial autopsy film that people debate is it real or not, but of an actual extraterrestrial having an autopsy performed on it. There's a famous film footage of that.
He said, well, does electronic waves, radio waves go through plastic? He said, why do you ask that? He said, because I think there's a radar unit in the nose of that airplane. And I'm saying, who are you talking about? I said, are you pilots?
So now he confronts them and says, who are you talking about? To these two guys talking in front of him.
And they shut up, turned around so I couldn't read their names, and walked on.
And then they shut up because they realize he's listening to them and walk away. Then the next clip is a daughter of an electrician who was working right outside the Air Force Base as this craft is actually descending and landing. But before I jump to that, any little thoughts on just that little part so far? Your mic is muted. It's all good.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say I'm still taking it in. Let's move on to the next clip and then we'll comment.
Cool. All right.
So I started up with my back to the sun, a safety measure, which also put my back to the runway where we thought his Connie was. Connie was a nickname for the big constellation the president flew. As I started up, some of the guys reminded me not to gawk, and I heard them laugh. A few minutes later, I heard some shouting, and some guys tarring a hangar roof nearby started to run, pointing out to the runways. Then I heard our truck start up, and some of the crew jumped in with one or two running after it. And they were pointing out to the flight line.
Wait, I'm sorry. I think I started at the wrong spot. 22:59.
So I started up with my back to the sun.
Actually, no, that's correct.
A safety measure.
Okay, so this is her father, who was an electrician working that day outside of Holloman Air Force Base.
Which also put my back to the runway where we thought his Connie was. Connie was a nickname for the big constellation the president flew. As I started up, some of the guys reminded me not to gawk, and I heard them laugh. A few minutes later, I heard some shouting, and some guys tarring a hangar roof nearby started to run, pointing out to the runways. Then I heard our truck start up, and some of the crew jumped in with one or two running after it. And they were pointing out to the flight line, and so I decided to turn around on the pole to see what the ruckus was about, and I could not believe what I saw. There was this pie tin-like thing coming at me about 150 feet away. I thought it was remote controlled or...
So this picture, and I need to confirm and validate, but I do believe this is a picture she provided. But don't quote me on that. But I do believe this is her father on the electric pole as the incident, somebody taking a picture as it's occurring, and this is Holloman Air Force Base behind it. But if not, then this is a good, dramatic, example of what it would look like. But I'm pretty sure this is a legitimate photo from her that was taken that day.
Like thing coming at me about 150 feet away. I thought it was remote controlled or something. 25 to 30 feet across, and I started down the pole as fast as I could go. I was up about 40 feet, and I threw my climbing rope out, gave it slack, and only touched the spike on each side of the pole 3 or 4 times on each side in before I got to the bottom. While I was running towards the big hangar, I looked back, and it had stopped and was just sitting there. Well, when we all got back to the shop and we had a good lap, one of the guys who saw me come down said he got down that pole faster than a fireman. So as you kids were growing up and we had the family gatherings, you used to ask to tell me about the time I became a fireman. You know, I always wondered why we did not use that thing during Vietnam and so forth. And over the years I realized if we had technology like that, it would have saved lots of lives. But I gradually realized that it had something to do with Ike being there that day. And it wasn't ours. There was an unwritten rule at Holloman: you didn't talk about what you saw, and after that day, it was seldom mentioned at the shop.
So, another witness that day, and it's tough, you know, obviously something in 1955 to get really, you know, firsthand testimony still, like Kirkland there, but those are two strong ones that I found that dealt with the Eisenhower that were actual credible forensics, kind of follow like people who were actually there to give the best. So you do rely a lot on these witness testimonies, but there's various things to back up what they're saying. You know, there's, I don't know all the exact specifics, but Eisenhower, from my remembering, and they touch on this in that video, he did delay. He was supposed to go to a certain trip and he delayed and said he went fishing and actually went to Holloman. There's all these strange things where basically Eisenhower made up sort of a cover story and actually went to Holloman. And there's actual, I'm pretty sure, public knowledge that's confirmed that that did happen, that he did say one thing and actually go to Holloman. But I'd have to look into that more specifically. So there's circumstantial evidence, and then there's these witness testimonies, and then there's like Laura, the granddaughter as well. But you are still kind of left with taking a little bit more at the word of the witnesses. And, you know, I am in the camp that these people are legitimate, and I do think it would make sense if this really was a phenomenon that was occurring and they had an opportunity like this. You know, and Eisenhower being a 5-star general right after the war, the president being a little bit different of a type of role at that time, contextually speaking, you could pull something like this off. Nowadays, I don't think that the president could be able to pull off something like he did. But yeah, so there's a little bit of the concept of that. What are some of your thoughts from those clips? Oh, you're muted again. All good.
Yeah, I'm getting into big picture now, and what that really means is, like, as I'm looking at this, I'm also taking a look at, like, what am I getting swept away by? What am I not asking questions around? And, like, you know, we talked about this, and I don't want to rehash a lot of what we talked about last week, but it was like, how do you know what you know? How do you know what you're hearing has legitimacy? And then how do you keep from being so skeptical that you don't believe anything that's coming at you, and also not so open-minded that you get to the gullible realm to where you're believing everything that's coming at you? So for me, could you just make that story up? I doubt these individuals are making individual stories up on their own. It would have to be some kind of centralized, concerted effort, like you say this and you say that and blah, blah, blah. But my thoughts on this is, like, what would be the purpose of faking this? Like, okay, I've gone through my head is, like, you know, some of these people, maybe they're just looking for attention. And then I think, okay, like a lot of us want attention. How many of us go to the media and say something appalling like that? I'm sure it must have happened, or it's on the possibility spectrum. And then I'm listening to this, and I'm taking a look at, you know, for the most part, when I get people who are like, oh, come on, like what you're saying is, you know, everyone would be talking about it. This is constantly what I hear. Everyone would be talking about it. That would be common knowledge if it had happened. You wouldn't be able to keep something like this quiet. I constantly hear those things. And then my thought is like, it's not quiet. You're hearing me talk about it. We're hearing other people, you know, witness talking about it. The talking about is happening, and it's happening in the millions of people that are talking about these kinds of things. So for the most part, people who would say, like, well, like, how could you keep something like this secret? We don't really understand how anything is kept secret. And we do at least agree upon that there's a lot that's kept secret from us. So like I'm just kind of that's kind of what I'm going through a lot of, and I want you to comment on this, but like when I'm personally like listening to this man's testimony and then this woman's testimony, and then I think back to the other testimony, like William Cooper, watching him give testimony from the Navy. This was before he started getting in. This was before 9/11, all that kind of stuff, and he was really giving his testimony. There are some interesting things that we've had to keep our mouths shut on. And, you know, maybe that was military operation. Maybe it was something that the military just knew about and they didn't want to get leaked out there. But there's tons and tons of testimony around this. And that's what makes it like so important that we start giving this context. And it's starting to help me understand as well as I'm going through this, because at the very end of the day, I don't know what this is all about. I couldn't help but I'm snooping through the chat that's happening on YouTube, and Jojo says prepping for a fake alien invasion ? And it's funny how that keeps coming up, and you can't dissociate that from what we're talking about here. Is like you're either being told the truth and there's something big coming, or you're not being told the truth and there's something big coming. You know, well, but that's the interesting thing about it.
Yeah, and it always tends to be somewhere in the middle a lot of times, right? Like
a lot of times, yeah. Like or something that we wouldn't, like, oh, I didn't even put that on the spectrum of possibility.
Right.
And that's what Catherine Austin Fitts says, is there's technologies out there that you just wouldn't call it a technology, like TV or a weaponry, I should say, that you can't wrap your head around. So you don't realize that it is completely brainwashing you, or it is completely creating the exact effect it wants, but because you can't conceive of it, you've just normalized it and you're just on with your day. And that's the thing, is like we're trying to conceive of a bigger picture of what's happening here. So hopefully if there is something that we as the layperson can do other than just stay glued to the internet to see what happens next, like it's a soap opera, then, you know, we really do need some of this context. So let's say there is a faked alien invasion. Does that prove that there is no such thing as aliens? Like, right. No, it just proves that there was a faked alien invasion. Maybe they're trying to fake it first, if it does ever happen, right, to control the narrative of something else coming out. And I don't believe that the mainstream media has, like, I don't believe everything coming out on the media is fake. I think a lot of it is true, and the narrative that's wrapped around it is after the fact. Oh, well, how do we use this world event to, you know, to bring it into our marketing pitch or our sales pitch for a new economic whatever, and you know what I'm saying?
Well, there's a few things that stand out. I mean, there's a lot of things that the mainstream does that is just they omit facts, they omit things, and so it's all about creating a certain narrative or perception about a certain thing. Like, oh yeah, there was a bombing in Syria, but is the perception of it that we need to go and murder and take out, you know, this horrible dictator, or for instance, you know, weapons of mass destruction. Oh, well, there are weapons of mass destruction. Do we need to go and create this whole war? And that is a case where there was completely, like, you know, we found really zero, and there was no evidence of that at all. But, you know, so there's different levels to this. And I'll kind of real quick, though, to touch back, though, on, yes, there's different levels of truth and falsehood. Sometimes it's pretty much 99% false. Sometimes it's maybe, 100%. It's always in between. It's never usually 100% false. It's never 100% true. Mm-hmm. So the key thing is take the most of the true stuff that you can verify and do your own due diligence on really researching yourself. And I know people have jobs and it's not always easy. And I wish always our trusted resources would actually do their job better and really challenge, you know, the power like it's supposed to be, the fourth estate. But that's just, you know, it is what it is. And that's a whole nother episode on what's happened to journalism and checking power. But the bottom line is that, look, you have to empower yourself. Like, this is why I really had beef with anything that says, wait around for something to save me, whether it's this superhero complex or it's Q or it's, you know, aliens or whatever it is. Like, we are the ones we've been waiting for, and we have to do things to empower ourselves by taking things within our control we have control over. So if you have questions or skeptics about a certain thing, really don't just like leave it at tertiary surface level and say, oh, I heard this thing once and I believe that person and that's it. Really do the due diligence, research this stuff, look at various independent perspectives and weigh the evidence really within the best of your ability to be as objective you can, to say, look, I'm not really trying to confirm one bias or the other. I'm just trying to figure out my bias is the truth. So what really is holding up the best and what smells like BS that's hard to prove. And sometimes you'll be left with like, this seems like 85, 90% to be the truth, but I don't have that missing 10% to completely concretely say this is the case. You know, that's how it is with this whole UAP phenomenon. Like, I'm like 95% sure that this is not just China, Russia, or the US in these crafts, that they're advanced beings. But that 5%, I know, I still, until I have like the government most likely showing me an evidence of an actual living being or talking to them, or the classic like landing on the lawn moment, like that'll be that last 5%. For a lot of my friends who are always like, I'm with you to this point, but I don't think it's extraterrestrial. And I'm like, okay, fine. You know, I know there's that last key thing to really push it over. And even the amount of like abducted experiencer research and meta-analysis of people talking about actually interacting and being on these crafts and all that, that's not going to be enough. Even if you listen to thousands of people and you think they're authentic. You know, I know there's just different levels of barometer and measurement for different people. It takes more for certain people to be proven something is correct, and that's okay. And at the end of the day, it's not about really. I've learned to let go of a lot of like trying to prove people wrong or getting that moment of being like, see, I told you so. I'm so past that. Early on, I was more like, you know, why are these people just not listening to me? You feel like this little kid in a movie being like, no, there really is this thing going on. Or like, okay, that's nice, honey. And it's sort of patronizing. But I've learned to try to get past that. And there's still times where, you know, it'll come up. But ultimately, like, it's bigger than any of us. It's bigger. Like, when you really start to think about the implications of this and what it means, it's so much bigger than any of us. And the history of it is probably so interesting and convoluted and has so many layers where, like I said, I don't know if we'll ever fully understand unless they have some way to actually show us, you know, with this type of tech, exactly what went down. Because the people that are going to start to tell us more and more of this stuff, they have their own conflicts of interest, like you're saying. They're not going to want to spill the whole beans because X, Y, and Z. It's a similar thing, and not to get tangential here, but for instance, if you have a lot of invested interest into, you know, certain, whatever. I'm not going to make the parallel to what's going on with virology and COVID, but you're starting to see, just like in any industry, there is conflict of interest on how much you'll discuss something. So
Tesla and Bitcoin, you know, and stuff along those lines, and just the questions. No, I totally feel you, man. And what I love about what we've done, you know, just to put it into perspective for people, is like we're looking at historical context for what's happening now. We're trying to like backtrack, you know, thanks to the work of Gordo here, finding and procuring a lot of this footage to just show little stepping stones of historical moments that are leading us up towards today. And what's great about it is like, you're right, like you need to have this context, and you need to have it, you know, from sources that are also still trying to figure it out themselves. And so with that being said, we went all the way back to World War II. And we started looking at the Foo Fighters, but even before that, a little bit with Operation Paperclip, and what was happening in the Third Reich and how that spread out and how that mission didn't end at the end of World War II. Admiral Byrd with Antarctica, where is some of the secret space program and some of the missing, you know, the black budget to get some of, like, I don't know what I would say is like some of the earthly technology going, you know, or have like there being a meeting place between whatever is going on here as far as these crafts and these things that we're starting to question now, even in the news, like where it could come from, who might be tied into it, what some governments may know and may not know. And so like we brought it pretty much all the way up to present day, and there's still 1,000 more things we could look at in this timeline.
Yeah, and so to give people a little bit just here a synopsis. Basically, this is, and I won't go through as in depth that I was planning, but basically this is the MJ12 document, and like I said, this is a controversial document. The FBI will say it's bogus. Robert Wood and Linda Moulton Howe have done a lot of research, as well as Stan Freeman, RIP, to validate and prove that they feel this is a actual authentic document. But this, and all these things are linked in the description of the YouTube video for people to really digest and go more in depth. But this really does go into basically the protocol to deal with extraterrestrial entities and technology. And it's really eerie and crazy how much they talk about things that, you know, what we say, how would they handle these kind of things, they go into. So just give people a little bit of a teaser. Essentially, though, they say, you know, MJ12 takes the subject of UFOs, extraterrestrial technology, and extraterrestrial biological entities very seriously and considers the entire subject matter to be of the highest national security. Everything has been assigned the very highest security classification. 3 main points will be covered: the general aspects of MJ12, the importance of operations, and the need for absolute secrecy in all phases of operation. And one little thing to note on what you said is like, and then this is, I think, a very natural and very normal and reasonable question or pushback from people is how would they keep this secret? This gets into how they keep it secret. And people who have worked in very classified programs can help, I think, illuminate how things are kept secret in our government. I mean, we know famously, obviously, the Manhattan Project had, I think, like 40, 50,000, a pretty high amount of people working on it. And that was maintained completely secret until the actual bombs were dropped. When Lazar talks about, whether you believe it or not, working at S4, at Area 51, he talks about their process, you know, and others. It's very compartmentalized. It's very much a need-to-know basis. And it's also a big reason why they say they haven't made a lot of progress, because scientists aren't working with each other and sharing information. You're only seeing one specific, very, very specific part of the engine. You're only seeing one very specific part of the craft. And so you don't know what the other guy's working on. You can't share research papers, you know, and that was one of the things different that the Nazis were doing, is they were sharing with each other. You know, we have compartmentalized everything for these exact reasons. They will sometimes give false information to find leaks, and there's these tactics we talked about. But bottom line is, like, yeah, the government, the CIA will have anonymous leaks with like policy and reasons to maybe invade a nation, sometimes be leaked to anonymous news source. And we know about Operation Mockingbird and how they kind of push agendas to then allow us to, you know, basically go somewhere and you know, this economic hitman type approach. But when it comes to, and Christopher Mellon just said this on Rogan, when it comes to keeping secrets, when it comes to like weapons and serious like tech and blueprints and things that aren't really sexy as a press release, we're really good at that. And those are the things that really are the nuts and bolts of what we're talking about here. Physical evidence, physical blueprints, physical bodies, you know, real hard evidence that deals with this stuff. I would argue, using various things I'm just referring to and other things, that we actually are, when it comes to these things, really good at keeping a secret. And there are ways outlined going back as early as this I think this was like 40, right after the war, document of how they go about it. So quickly, you know, touching on that, essentially they talk about the history of the group, and this is where it was important. It was established by a special classified presidential order on September 24th, 1947, at the recommendation of Secretary of Defense James Forrestal and Dr. Vannevar Bush, chairman of the Joint Research and Development Board. Operations are carried out under a top-secret research and development intelligence group directly responsible only to the President of the United States. The goals of the MJ12 group are as follows: the recovery of scientific study of all materials and devices, foreign or extraterrestrial; the recovery for scientific study of all entities and remains of entities not of terrestrial origin, which may become available through independent action by those entities or by misfortune or military action; the establishment and administration of special teams to accomplish the above operations; the establishment and administration of special secure facilities located at secret locations within the continental borders of the U.S. for receiving, processing, analysis, and scientific study of any and all material entities classified as being of extraterrestrial origin. So this is Grom Lake, this is S4, this is all these facilities you hear about on these deep underground military bases. This is where they would spend trillions of dollars without it causing massive hyperinflation in our economy, is building massive infrastructure to support this whole operation that Dolan and Alton Fitz feel is where that money's going. Covert operations, establishing those to be carried out in concert with the Central Intelligence to effect the recovery of the United States of extraterrestrial tech and entities which may come down inside the territory or fall into possession of foreign powers. The establishment and maintenance of absolute top secrecy concerning all the above operations. They get into a little bit of the current situation. It's nothing too big there. Let's see, they described the craft, elliptical or disc-shaped craft. This type of craft is a medical construction, dull aluminum color. No seams or joints are visible on the surface, giving the impression of a one-piece construction. That's exactly the same thing that Lazar talked about. He said no seams or joints. It was completely, looked like it would just been 3D printed. 50 to 300 feet in diameter, and thickness is approximately 15% of the diameter. The next craft is fuselage or cigar-shaped crafts. I mean, these are all the exact descriptions of craft and that we see that are the major reports. You know, This one they say could be 2,000 feet long and 95 feet thick, which is massive. They apparently don't operate in lower atmosphere. The other one is ovoid or circular shaped craft. An ice cream cone being rounded at large and end and tapering, so that's a little bit more like a gimbal, maybe one, 30 to 40 feet. And then the the triangle shaped craft, which is newer tech, they say, longest side being nearly 300 feet in length. So those are all the major craft types that we've seen that they describe already early on. The description of biological entities, humanoid, 80 to 100 pounds. These are kind of like the small gray looking type ones they describe here. Then they have a type 2. And then the last key things really is they kind of describe some of the tech, the metallurgy, the debris. It's able to be extremely strong, heat resistant, better than anything we possess or civilian aircraft. It has the appearance of aluminum foil, but it displays none of the characteristics, acting like some kind of unknown plastic material. And then press blackout, part of how you maintain security. So I'll kind of let people dive into this more in depth, but this really gets into specifically how they maintain security and all these things. They talk about where they take the actual craft at this part. All the places that have become notorious now. Area 51 is where they take damaged craft, fragments, actual aircraft. Blue Lab is Wright-Patterson, WP is from what Stan Freeman said. And the KB is Kirkland Air Force Base, is what Freeman said. So they really get into it all in this. And obviously this document, it's debatable whether you believe it or not. I also gave a link if you guys want to check out just the basics of ufology. And then we also have just a list of UFO sightings on the timeline. If you just want to have better context, goes all the way back to Nuremberg and all the classic ones from the Battle of LA to the sightings over DC in 1952. So there's a bunch of sightings, and it goes all the way up to the O'Hare International Airport, and then after that is obviously the very legitimate ones that we just talked about last podcast. So that's all in the description. There's a bunch there, as you guys can see, but I would love to, in another episode, dive deep into the secret space program, because that really is the most exciting and intriguing side of things now, and what's could be part of all what's going on is, both those things, keeping in mind what they want the public to know about. So
yeah.
It's
and
pretty
it's getting
wild.
to a fever pitch. That's the interesting thing. Like in society, it's getting to a fever pitch. Like whatever it is, I know we harped on this last episode, and we've even talked about it a little bit today. But it's not nothing that 60 Minutes is putting out something on this. It's not nothing that there's a 180-day ticking disclosure clock that's coming up next month. And I don't believe it's completely disconnected. Maybe it is, but I don't believe it's completely disconnected with what started in what we perceive to have started in 2020 and is going on right now. And people like Charles Eisenstein are talking about. I know I'm mentioning him a lot. I just watched this interview where he's talking about a lot of what we're noticing today, especially with the COVID thing, is just a peek preview at where we've been going for quite some time. Masks, social distancing, these kinds of mandates, they're not new, but it's almost like a speeding up of potential, futures of what we can look at. And right now, technology, I've been saying this for a while, 2020 to 2030 is going to be a very interesting year in technology rolling out. And it's just very interesting that now in 2021, here we're talking about this, right at the precipice of this interesting great turning. Because we talked about past wars, and I want to wrap this up here. But we talked about past wars, and every 90 years there seems to be this major war that's called the Dark Winter or Great Winter period, an archetypal period where it's always marked by war. And in these 90-year intervals, technology and weaponry advance to a point where it comes on display. Whether whether we can get into the nuances and say, but it was this group that did it this time and that group that did it that time. But if you look at how the Dutch East India Corporation started monopolizing on corporate sales and getting products over to Asia by, getting around the Silk Road and all the taxes, You take a look at who is dominant. It's who had the best ships and the best guns, who had the best weaponry. And it just kept going in that direction. It's not like for thousands of years we didn't know that there were indigenous people in the Americas. It was well known. It's just we didn't have the weaponry to go over and colonize. But once we had the metallurgy and the weaponry and stuff that wasn't going on in this country, in the New World, but it was going on in the Old World, then they were like, land grab. We have the technology. It's time for land grab. And every 90 years, we start getting this newer technology on display. And the thing about the Great Winter is every single time it's at least always ended in war. And every single time it's ended in war, the most incredible, magnificent weapons of destruction are on display every 90 years. And now we're in the middle of, the next 90 years, has happened. And now we're in the winter period. We're in the height of the winter period. And where's the war? It kind of feels like the war is happening with what we will believe, what we will acquiesce to. It doesn't have to be by force. A lot of the times it's by coercion. And the weaponry that we're seeing a lot more now today looks just like advanced technology. And yeah, so just like whatever this might be, I think it's very interesting. Let's at least appreciate and bring in gratitude for this moment in history that we're at. Let it not scare us. Right. But let it be what it is. Let's not, put our heads in the sand and pretend like it's something that it's not. This is a big monumental time in history. So I appreciate you, Gordo, taking us through at least, about a little more than roughly 100 years of context leading us up to, because World War II wasn't exactly 100 years ago. World War II was the last Great Winter, Great Depression. So here we are. Since that period, looking at where technology has come, where this story has come, where some of the disclosure and some of the, testimonies and anecdotes have come from. So, there's so many places we can go from there.
Yeah, and I appreciate it. And I'll just kind of leave it with this too, is I think the key thing is that I'm a strong, strong believer in the more we know, the more we have context, the less we are afraid, right? I think ignorance leads to fear, and then fear can lead to anger and desperate bad actions. And I think that's what this all is ultimately about, is trying to give people more knowledge and context. So if these things really do start to unfold quickly come June, I don't want us to take that fear route, like we were saying in the last episode. I really want us to choose a more loving path that's not the warlike path, to go to war with some unknown off-world threat, because there's a good, strong chance that this is a kind of prepping to try to push that agenda. As a lot of people are saying, it's a psyop to push that, There's a very good chance of that, but that doesn't mean it's an absolute. It's a guarantee that that's going to happen. We still have the numbers, we still are the people, and we can still really push back against that occurring and saying no, and we won't get into as much, but the more context you have, the less you can get played, the less you can get exploited, the less you can get taken advantage of. So, that's kind of my goal and hope with all this is, look, we might not say everything is exactly true, but at least you'll have a lot more context to make a more informed decision as these things start to unfold. Because, like you said, this is a serious precipice point, and I want it to go the right way. I think we all do, who are rational, good people.
Yeah, true. I appreciate that, and we didn't leave much time for comments here. I was kind of looking through all of it. It was kind of disparate, what was being said here. Some good points. Someone said, Ben Frank said, I think there are too many UFO eyewitnesses with similar experiences to deny the presence of aerial phenomena. There are lights in the sky. Most have seen them. Few talk. What are they? Who are they? I want to talk about that next time when we talk about that yellow cube again. What are they? These lights in the sky. I want to talk about that next time.
Yeah.
Just make sure you remind me.
Yeah, that's the secret space program. We can touch on that and continue with Richard Dolan's work of who specifically are these groups and sort of speculate on the analysis of that.
Yeah, and Kevin was one of the last ones who just chimed in. He said, I first heard of you, Ben, on the Max Egan interview. Max is a good friend of mine with Chimerica over a decade ago. It helped me in a hard time, especially when you said, don't focus on a door closed in front when another one is open beside. I don't remember saying that, but I'm happy that helped. I'm getting a lot of people just recently coming back up and saying Kymedica really helped them. And I just have to say again, like, I can't even take 100% credit for that because, yeah, I did it, but I barely remember it. And it was like I was in some kind of trance state. I'm not going to pretend I channeled it or anything like that. I'm just going to say that it was important for me as well. And so yeah, so just going through the comments, I love you. Thank you. I mean, like there's just a lot of comments. There's a lot of engagement. I want to get better at going through some of them, but ask some questions, bring up some topics that we can get into and dive deeper on this. And, if there's challenges, if there's legitimate challenges, bring some evidence and things that we can kind of turn over rather than just statements. And we'll get to it. That's the one thing that we're trying to do here is dig away at some of the rhetoric that's out there and really just kind of bring it down to, what can we know? How can we know it? Let's have the conversation. Let's put it into context because there's something that's coming out. There's something that's coming out on a larger scale. And I just imagine by 2022, 2023, where this story is going to be by then, I don't know, but I'm excited for that. So Ben Frank, thank you. Nicole, Win Huygens, thank you. There's a lot of really good people in the chats. Come on next Thursday. Every Thursday we're doing this, and we are in a series. It's kind of like the space series. We're talking about, first we were into the psychedelic Renaissance series, and now we're talking about these kinds of things leading up to whatever disclosure might look like in June from that omnibus package. And we'll go through these series and bring on people. If you guys have suggestions of people that should be having these conversations with us, throw the suggestions our way. But make sure you get involved somehow. Here's the statement I'll leave y'all on. I think that whatever is happening here, if it's spiritual, if it's metaphysical, if it's just propaganda, whatever it is, it requires us to get more engaged and to have an open mind and to start considering that there's more stuff to consider here. And I'll point out DMT Quest in the comments there. That's John Chavez. And, he and I have talked about where even DMT Quest is going to go, talking about endogenous DMT and the fact that we have drugs in us at all times. And you could say we're honestly on DMT at all times. And how DMT kind of comes into the conversation of what are some of these, extraterrestrial or pan-dimensional or hyperdimensional, crypto-terrestrial creatures. I want to get deeper into that because I really do feel that that's also coming to a fore. Psychedelic Renaissance is coming to a fore. There's legit, Imperial College London, that's a legit university that's like, yeah, let's put people under high doses of DMT for extended periods of time. Why? Not because we think it's going to help with headaches or back pain or anything like that, but because people keep saying they communicate or have experiences with extremely intelligent creatures. Meanwhile, we're talking about UFOs and UAPs on 60 Minutes, and we're having these conversations. Something's going on, so keep engaged, find your voice. Don't tune anything out. If it's starting to come up, take a look at it. Don't get swept away at it, but at least start building the context that we're trying to build here. And is there anything you wanted to leave everyone on, Gordo?
I'm just excited. I'm excited to have this conversation. I'm excited as things continue to develop. And yeah, I think it gives us a lot. It gives me a lot of optimism. I don't rely on this to be the sole reason, but I don't know, man. When I look up at the stars now, it's different. I'll just leave it at that.
Touche. I could say the same thing after I did DMT the first time. I don't look at the stars or plants or myself, my hands, the same way. And I'm trying not to over-establish, these substances. We got to take everything with a grain of salt and really move slowly through all this. So man, maybe we just leave it there, and next week either we have a guest or it's me and you again diving deeper into the secret space program, and potentially we'll talk about crypto-terrestrial beings and what that means for your Bitcoin purse, whatever that, like we'll get into some of this stuff. Yeah, exactly. So much love to you all. Really appreciate all the support. Gordo, appreciate all the time that you putting all this together. So people could have a little bit more context. And if anyone has any questions, go to benjosephstewart.com, become a member, check out the Waking Infinity News, check out the deeper dives that we go into. I'm going to start touching base on some of these topics as well. And if you guys have any questions, just redirect it there, get involved in the Discord chat, and I'll catch you all next time on the Ben Stewart Podcast.